Hi, this is Benjamin Kerstein. I'm a film critic for various publications, Yediot Ahronoth, The New Ledger, The Federalist. I've also put out a book called Cinephilia, which is available on Amazon. And I'm here to engage in a little self-indulgence and do a critic's commentary to Oliver Stone's extremely controversial and in some ways very extraordinary film JFK. And what I'm going to do is, if you want to watch the film along with it, I'm going to give you a countdown uh, because obviously I can't put it up for copyright reasons. I can't put up the film itself. So um, I'll do a countdown from five. And basically, I'm doing this for my own, my own amusement, and I hope for yours. So I'm going to start the film just as the Warner Brothers logo fades out and the opening titles start to come in. So I'm going to start in five, four, three, two, one, now. Um, can't say enough really about John Williams's extraordinary score. I mean, it just both in terms of it has a grandeur and also an element of fright, fear, paranoia, beauty. It really is an amazing piece of work. Might be his best score, actually, which is saying a lot. Um, it actually is interesting that we open up on Eisenhower Speech, which is a favorite of anti war people on both the left and the right, um, because it's really the first of the film's major, I suppose you could call it in this case a distortion. It's not quite a lie, but what Eisenhower says here is what he said. I mean, it's obvious, you see him saying it, but it's completely ripped out of the context of his larger speech, which is what almost always happens when it's used by people who are trying to make an activist point. He does warn about the influence of the military-industrial complex, but if you read the rest of the speech, it's very clear that he also says right before that the military-industrial complex is absolutely necessary, and the United States has to be the arsenal of democracy and defend its allies. And he actually says, I think word for word, our arms must always be at the ready. So the idea that Eisenhower was some sort of a hippie peacenik or an isolationist right winger is completely untrue. And this film, is engages in I don't know really how to put it. I mean, I don't want to say the film is a pack of lies, but I mean, pretty much everything that's put out in this film is, I think it's safe to say, false, um, to one degree or another. And I think that using the Eisenhower speech in that very disingenuous way at the beginning sets the tone for the whole rest of the picture. Uh, to the extent that this film is makes a broader point, that point is fantasy. In the details, some of what it writes is simply untrue. Some of what it has to say is totally untrue. Some of it's completely distorted. Some of it's taken deliberately out of context, and some of it is frankly reprehensible. Which brings me to the larger issue that I see with this film, which is that I put it, and this may offend some people, but I put it with a group of movies that I would call great evil films. I mainly D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation and Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. Birth of a Nation being essentially an ode to American racism and ultimately a film which I think is genocidal towards black people. And Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will being, of course, a film meant to lionize Adolf Hitler and the Nazi movement. They are both extraordinary pictures. I mean, great films. There's no question that as an aesthetic work, they are almost flawless. I mean, just extraordinary artistic achievements. And they are also utterly evil and reprehensible pictures. And I think JFK, I won't necessarily say it's quite a great film. it's flawed. It's too long. There's the family scenes with Kevin Costner and his family are pretty cheesy. Um, but it's over the top, obviously over the top. Garrison's final monologue, Jim Garrison's final summation speech at the end goes on forever. But I think on the whole, this is a very much like a nearly great picture, and certainly an extraordinarily done. Yeah, and this here is as John Williams' theme changes suddenly to the sort of conspiracy theme, and this is like what makes this film so extraordinary is that the way that Stone uses the montage juxtaposing this woman screaming with Kennedy's arrival in Dallas, and you're sort of thinking, who is this woman? Why? What does she know? Where does she come from? And it creates a mystery that immediately draws you in, and Stone has you in his pocket in the first 30 seconds, the first minute, of this picture. When you have the scene with this woman, you're just immediately completely swept up in this picture, and of course juxtaposing it with JFK, when you know what's about to come, that he's hours away from being murdered. It also brings you into that sweep of history that this film tries to depict, and in some ways it sums up what's so great about this movie, but at the same time it sums up so much of what is bad about this movie, because there's no evidence that Rose Sheremy, who's the woman being portrayed there's no evidence whatsoever that she knew anything about a conspiracy against JFK, and she was a woman who was strung out on drugs and probably mentally ill and was just, hallucinating, and Stone turns this into some sort of, which he never explains, by the way, because she never appears in the film again. So there's no indication of, what connection she actually, in Stone's mind, had, but she had nothing to do with what's about to be depicted in terms of the assassination. The books that this film is based on, the credit you're about to see here, that you saw just before, pretty much sums things up. Jim Mars is a complete lunatic who has all kinds of conspiracy theories about the Freemasons and UFOs and government cover-ups of extraterrestrial activities on Earth and all this other stuff. And Jim Garrison was corrupt, possibly mentally diseased man, a person who persecuted an innocent man in Clay Shaw. And this film obviously persecutes Clay Shaw as well in an extremely, the word disgusting may be too much, but in an extremely reprehensible manner, certainly. I remember when I first saw this in the theater, the tension that was built up in this scene was unbearable. You know what's going to happen. And you see here what Stone is doing in terms of the montage and his use of editing and sound effects here. Yeah. And then just those birds flying up off the building. That's probably the only thing in the film that's accurate. The birds did fly off the building when the shots were fired. And the way that he uses the iconography. I mean, so many people remember this CBS News bulletin. So many people remember Walter Cronkite announcing Kennedy's death. And obviously there's the Zapruder film, which probably the most iconic amateur piece of film footage ever shot. Utterly horrifying document of, that has etched itself into American history. And here it comes in Kevin Costner, who I think is really very good in the film. He was really at the height of his fame and success when this film came out. He just won the Oscar for Dances with Wolves as Best Director. I don't think he won Best Actor. I don't remember exactly, but he was really at the top of his game when he did this picture, and his accent goes in and out. Costner always had problems with accents in all of his pictures, but this he standing at the center of this maelstrom of facts and at the maelstrom of this relentless montage. That swirls around him, and yet he allows a very solid. Stone called him the anchor of the film, and he does. He has a very solid presence that I think, in some ways, he is the audience. He brings you on the journey that he's going on at the same time, and Costner completely pulls it off. And you got to give him credit. He has a great presence in the picture, and manages to get across the completely fictional Garrison. Yeah, this is the moment when Cronkite almost loses it. That's so iconic, and Stone uses it so well. You know. But I think Costner also has that all-American Gary Cooper, John Wayne kind of persona. One of the few Hollywood actors that still did, you know. And I think he should get more credit than he does get for this picture. I think he was nominated for an Oscar, I believe so, and didn't win, but I think he was. And I think here we're going to go into the first piece of nonsense. This whole scene, this whole sequence with Jack Lemmon and Ed Asner is a great example to me of what I think this film, the conundrum of this film. It's absolutely fascinating, mysterious scene. It's scintillating. These two men, and again, it's like he did with Rose Cherami. It's like who are these people? What are they? What's their deal? Like, are they involved? Are they not involved? Like, are they? You feel like there's a mystery here that's going to be slowly unfolding for you throughout the rest of the picture. And of course, Lemmon particularly is marvelous in it. And the way that Stone deploys his stars, this extraordinary cast that he put together for this movie, of using the stars as sort of signposts along the way, and also telling you who's important, who you should pay attention to. Because if this guy's played by Jack Lemmon, he must have some sort of important role to play, and it keeps you in, to as he starts to unfold these mysteries. This is all Stone talking about how everyone thought the shots came from the grassy knoll. That's nonsense. The overwhelming majority of witnesses thought the shots came from the Texas Book Depository, and a large number of the rest couldn't tell, because Dealey Plaza was really a big echo chamber, and there were people who thought there were 8-10 shots, which Stone eventually says in his summation at the end of the picture, but it's not true, and it's an example of Stone cooking the books in his favor, which he does throughout this movie. More or less everything as I said, more or less everything that's asserted in this movie about the assassination is not true, beyond the fact, obviously, that John Kennedy was killed. That's about the only true thing. Here's our first glimpse of Gary Oldman, who is so extraordinary in this film, just becoming Lee Harvey Oswald. In every way, you look at footage of Oswald, and then you see Oldman in this film, and it's uncanny. I mean, it's really scary, quite frankly, how close he is. Even, that weird way he talks, that strange cadence in his voice. It's something else. It really is. He should have had an Oscar for this. I think it's his best performance, which is saying something, because Oldman's really an extraordinary actor, one of the great actors of his generation, and I think this is his finest hour, I think, in a lot of ways. This scene actually happened. Guy Bannister did beat, can't remember the real guy's name, but the Ed Asner character did beat the Jack Lemmon character with a pistol. But it was an argument over, I think, money or something like that. It had nothing to do with JFK or anything like that. Jack Martin is the guy that Jack Lemmon is playing. Jack Martin was basically a very bad alcoholic and a fabulist, and Jim Garrison seized upon him and Garrison basically got him to say the things that Garrison wanted him to say, and the rest is pseudo history, at least. The way this film is cut, I mean, there was cutting this fast before. And especially, this film came out in the early 90s, and especially when in music videos. MTV was very big at this time, and there's a lot of very fast cutting in music videos. But Stone here, I think, this is really every point at which this film is great has to do with the cutting, I think, and some of the acting, but especially the cutting, and the use of montage, to use the pretentious term, which I have to do because there's no real substitute. The use of montage in this picture is really when the film becomes great. There's a lot of stuff in this movie that straddles the line of camp and straddles the line of silliness, and just becoming outright fantasy. And as soon as the montage starts, this becomes just a great film. So I would say that when the editing really starts to get going at various points, and I think particularly in the scene in the trial at the end when he reenacts the assassination essentially for you, his version of the assassination, it's just a tour de force. I mean, it really doesn't get much better than this. Yeah, there's Oldman. Just wow. It's uncanny. Here's your first glimpse of Jack Ruby in it's rather tiresome how what Stone does with Jack Ruby. Ruby was really I think a very pathetic character, and in some ways a tragic character. He was volatile, emotional, I think probably slightly mentally ill, maybe manic depressive, given to outbursts of rage and violence, and really a small time guy, a nightclub owner. He was nothing like the kind of mob. I mean, this film portrays him as a kind of like top mob assassin or something, which is complete rubbish. He was very tangentially connected to the mob only because he was a nightclub owner in Dallas, and nightclubs were connected to the mob. So in that sense, he had a tangential relationship with them, but not a great deal more than that. And he just in some ways he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and impulse got the better of him, and that was that. And there wasn't a great deal more to it than that. And Stone sort of tries to turn him into something much more than he was. Both Oswald and Ruby were basically losers. I hate to use that word because I hate the idea of winners and losers, but both Oswald and Ruby were sort of losers whose paths met in a very random and fatal way one day, and that was all there was to it, really. Neither of them were what Stone portrays them as. Oswald is portrayed as a kind of master spy, and Ruby is played as this sort of mob enforcer / hitman who wants to reveal the horrible conspiracy to the Warren Commission, but is unable. And in a deleted sequence, Stone showed him being killed, murdered, which is also complete rubbish. He was a very sick man and died of completely natural causes. But there was no, they were nothing on that grand a scale. They were both sick people, I suppose. I don't like using that word either, but they were, ill, maladjusted, neurotic people, and that led to violence. And they wrote themselves into history in the worst way. So, here we go into down the rabbit hole, basically, going into David Ferrie. David Ferrie is one of the great tragedies, I think, really. Here we go with Ruby. Stone goes on and on in his commentary to this film. How did Ruby get in? It's a great mystery of how Ruby got in and managed to kill Oswald. It's no secret how Ruby got in. He walked in. Yeah. God, but the way they recreate that, dead accurate. It's just extraordinary. I mean, it's like newsreel footage, how they do it. Absolutely amazing. Yeah. Wow. I mean, the attention to detail is extraordinary. You gotta give Stone credit. I mean, it's meticulous. He puts these things together. And also, it's got to be said, Ruby got lucky. I mean, Ruby not only managed to be in the right place at the right time or the wrong place at the wrong time, if you want to see it that way. But he was known by the Dallas police force. He'd been hanging around the scene. He was someone who always wanted to be a part of these things. And I think the Dallas police just didn't take him seriously. They saw him as a kind of cop groupie, and in the excitement of the thing, Ruby was in kind of a manic state, running around pretending to be a journalist and stuff like that. And he just suddenly saw his chance and almost, I think, without thinking about it, attacked. And he got very lucky or unlucky, if you want to see it that way. And he managed to shoot Oswald. He just got a lucky shot, and that one bullet, the wound to Oswald was extremely severe, just by pure luck, and was definitely fatal. There was no, if he'd shot Oswald in the emergency room, he would have died. So here's Joe Pesci, who is extraordinary in this movie, doing his thing, the James Cagney of our time here, who's just marvelous in the movie. David Ferrie is was one of Garrison's victims, I think, and a victim again of Stone in this movie. Ferrie had nothing to do with the assassination, and was, I think, really, according to everyone who knew him, was actually a very very nice guy. He was a little messed up. He was gay. He was a recovering Catholic. He had alopecia or whatever it was. That he had no hair, which is why he wore the weird painted on eyebrows. He was a New Orleans eccentric, but everyone I've from what I've read, everyone who knew him, who was not a conspiracy nut, said that he was really a pretty good guy, and Garrison basically drove him into his grave, more or less. The stress of being one of Garrison's suspects, one of the guys Garrison was going after. He was never charged, by the way, and was never going to be charged, as near as people can ascertain. But the pressure of being under Garrison's knee, the stress of that eventually gave him a stroke, and he died. He died of what they call a Barry aneurysm, contrary to what this film claims. But I mean, Pesci's so great in this scene. Really is wonderful, and he's. But it's also again, the film here walks right to the edge of silliness, because Ferrie is so. I mean, Pesci is so over the top, and Ferrie is so obviously lying. I mean, in the scene as it's depicted, and with smoking endless cigarettes and going on about how I want to go there ice skating and all this sort of stuff. Totally unbelievable. He's so obviously a liar that. I mean, Stone is so obviously stacking the deck. You can almost laugh at it, and people do laugh at this scene. It is a funny scene, But I think this film jackknifes so quickly between seriousness and almost comic over the topness, which is one of Stone's, that's what you get with an Oliver Stone film. Stone is over the top. That's his deal. You expect that, but and you take it or you leave it, and that's sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But this film really haywires between near camp and great seriousness. Almost like Poe-face seriousness, to the point where it's sort of like enough. Really, but. There's a great line here where he goes, "What part? Really? What part?" It is very funny. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, Pesci's great. One of the great actors, I think, of his generation. He's so good in The Irishman, which just came out. He's fantastic in that. But the amount of energy that, this is another iconic moment. The way Stone weaves these iconic moments into the film to give it not only verisimilitude but emotional impact is pretty extraordinary, and how dangerous it is, because Stone is always, like I said, on the edge of going too far, and there are points in this film when he goes too far, and it does harm the movie, and it's a flaw. But when he makes it work, it really is something to behold. It's quite extraordinary. Yeah. Again, the fix is in. Oh, the FBI, they're covering it up. It's nonsense. The The FBI didn't do anything with Ferrie because there wasn't anything to do with Ferrie. He was totally unconnected, completely innocent. So, um, yeah, but I think that's one with Stone's style. You know, he is an extremely talented man, I think, and he's made some terrific movies. And I just think it's a shame that his political and conspiratorial beliefs have, I think, really buried his talent. You know, he's really crushed his talent beneath the weight of his fanaticism. It has to be said. You know. Um, this is his last really good movie, I think, to be honest with you. He blew himself out on this film, I think. Just burned himself out. He'd had an amazing run through the sort of middle 80s to the early 90s. He'd made Platoon, Wall Street, Born on the 4th of July, The Doors, which is not quite as good as those other ones, but I think is still a pretty great movie, you know. And you know, so he had 4 or 5 really terrific films that he'd done in a row, you know, and was a serious filmmaker at a point when movies were not so serious. Stone was really kind of a throwback to the filmmakers of the 70s, you know, and uh, um, you know, making personal films and making films that took chances and making films that, whether you agreed with them or not, challenged you and sort of, you know, didn't hold back in any way and risked being unpopular and risked being too much for the audience, you know. And it was, you know, he was really in some ways anticipated the independent film movement of the 90s. Him and Spike Lee really, but Spike Lee also being a very political filmmaker, they really this part here is again one of Stone's egregious distortions. You know, this is all nonsense. Yeah, that dog don't hunt again, over the top there. And then when he says Oswald had Maggie's drawers, meaning he wasn't any good, that's rubbish. Maggie's drawers means that they thought he was gay. Um, I don't know that Oswald was homosexual, you know, but I don't see any. There's no evidence of it. But he, you know, as in the army, certain people get singled out and bullied, and Oswald was. He was seen as being somewhat effeminate. That's what Maggie drawers means. Oswald was. He wasn't a world-class sniper, but he was a perfectly competent shot and certainly good enough to do the shooting. So the timing is also wrong. The Warren Commission never set out an absolute time frame for the shots. This idea of 5.6 seconds, which this film comes back to over and over and over again. He couldn't have done the shooting in 5.6 seconds. The Warren Commission didn't say 5.6 seconds. They said it happened that there was a sort of a low end and a high end in terms of the shots. And I don't remember precisely what it was. It was somewhere between like 5.5 seconds to 8 seconds that it could have happened in. And that the only real evidence they had for the shots was the Zapruder film. And so that according to the Zapruder film, they couldn't quite estimate exactly the time frame of the shooting itself. But it was sort of, there was an upper and a lower sort of a limit. And it was a variation of 2 or 3 seconds, but more than enough to allow for Oswald to do what he did. You know, Marine trained sniper. You know, Marine trained rifleman anyway. You know, yeah, and not a bad one. You know, he scored somewhere in the sort of upper middle, I think. So, anyway, Stone really, you know, he was really at his peak when he made this film, and I think this is his best film. I think he feels that way too, from what I've read. And after that, it's a sort of a downward slide. He made a film called Heaven and Earth, which I haven't seen. It didn't get much play. He made Natural Born Killers, which I think is a terrible movie, just really, really bad. And you know, and I don't, you know, after that, it's sort of a slide off into irrelevance. Nixon is not particularly good, and I honestly haven't seen most of his other movies. And you know, they haven't really aroused anywhere near the kind of intense attention and controversy and acclaim. This film was quite well reviewed. It was heavily criticized, but as a film, I think, in terms of as a piece of cinema, I think it was pretty universally praised. You know, what it had to say was intensely criticized, but nobody said that it was a bad movie as a movie. I don't think. There were a few people who said it was over the top in terms of the editing. So it won the Oscar for best editing, which it absolutely should have. And someone said it won the Oscar for most editing, which is, there's some truth in that, but I don't think it goes too far on that level. I think it's the cutting is incredibly effective and powerful. This is the first of these sort of domestic scenes, which I think are really very maudlin and cheesy and pointless and just sort of mar the film, I think, But it was him this is Stone trying to push the Garrison myth that he's creating, this myth of Garrison as, Mr. Smith goes to the assassination, as I think Stone put it. He's the all-American family man, and he goes down this rabbit hole of evil and injustice that he has to, that as a result of which his life is turned upside down, and he sacrifices that perfect family life that he has on behalf of justice and truth. That's basically Stone's mythology of Garrison. There's very little truth in it, but it was a creative decision that Stone made, and you can sort of take it or leave it. I don't think it works particularly well, but he had to do it because he's in trying to make Garrison into a saint. There was no other choice. This questioning of Lee Bowers is another good example of Stone playing fast and loose. The bit where Bowers talks about a flash of light or a puff of smoke, Bowers didn't say that. Not to the Warren Commission, excuse me. He told the Warren Commission that he didn't see, he saw some people milling around or something like that, which, people were watching the president. So the tramps too, I'll get to the tramps. This is also nonsense with the tramps. The tramps are all identified and proven to be totally unconnected. They were what they appeared to be. They were tramps. But Bowers said he saw some people milling around and it caught his eye. But that's all. That's all he told the Warren Commission. Mark Lane, who is the godfather of all JFK assassination conspiracy theories. Mark Lane was a left-wing lawyer from New York who became the first really outspoken assassination conspiracy theorist and wrote a book called Rush to Judgment that came out in 1966 and was really the first, I think 66, and was really the first big best-selling book about supposedly a conspiracy theory. Mark Lane claimed that Bowers told him, before Bowers died, told him that he'd seen a flash of light and a puff of smoke. I can't say this with any certainty, but my guess is that Mark Lane made that up. Mark Lane, I think, is a fairly reprehensible person, God rest, but he was Lane, I think. I think, for example, Stone is absolutely sincere in what he says here, what he has to say in this film. I think Stone believes this absolutely. I don't think he's consciously lying. He's not trying to deceive you. He really believes all this stuff, I think he's sincere in this film. This is a sincere picture. Lane, I think, enjoyed the game. I think Lane, who was an attorney and mainly a defense attorney for radical causes, Lane, I think, felt that he was playing the part of the defense attorney. He was basically Oswald's defense attorney, if you like, and he, what a defense attorney does, is in many cases lie. It's why lawyers have such a good reputation in society. They make stuff up and they present quote unquote alternate theories, and they try and use whatever rhetorical and other means at their disposal in order to make their case, which is in some ways what they're supposed to do. That's fine. They're supposed to be aggressive and present the best defense. And I think Lane did that. And I think Lane knew at many, many points that he was, playing fast and loose with the truth, and did it, I think, rather gleefully and had a lot of fun with it. But which is, when you're a lawyer in a courtroom, you're allowed some leeway. But when you're ostensibly writing history, I think that's really quite disgusting behavior. So my guess is that he made up that bit about Bowers and the flash of light and puff of smoke. Bowers might have said it. There's no proof that there was anybody on the grassy knoll. There's no, certainly none of the physical evidence that existed in the book depository. But my guess is Lane either made that up or twisted it to such an extent as to essentially have made it up. This again is kind of this silly scene. He wakes up out of a dream and immediately starts, babbling, conspiracy theory stuff to his wife at 4 a.m. It's pretty ridiculous. And here we go into the idea that Oswald was an intelligence agent. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. Oswald was, like I said, kind of a loser and a very, very screwed up individual, and an ideologue, a true believer in communism, to the extent that he understood communism, and did what he did, I think, to write himself into history. As he himself said to one of the cops, everyone will know who I am. That's one of the reasons a lot of assassins do that, lone nut assassins, you know what I mean? I certainly would not say in any way that intelligence agencies don't assassinate people, and that they don't sometimes assassinate prominent people, and people even from their own governments. It happened in countries around the world. Certainly, it just isn't. It isn't true in this case. There's no. It really comes down for me to this. This also is nonsense. Everything here is nonsense. There was no connection between Oswald and Bannister, and there was no connection certainly with Clay Shaw. And there was what he says about these entrances both leading to the same offices is not true at all. So anyway, getting back to it, where I think the conspiracy theorists go wrong and where Stone goes wrong is they use mostly what I call negative evidence, which is they say, well, this isn't here, therefore the official version can't be true and there was a conspiracy. In other words, they say, like, well, again, Oswald wasn't a very good shot, therefore he couldn't have done the shooting, therefore there was a CIA conspiracy. There were, you can say, well, there was Oswald's palm print on the rifle wasn't found by the FBI, ergo it was planted there, ergo there was a conspiracy, ergo the CIA killed JFK along with the mafia and Texas oilmen and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can see the fault in that logic very quickly, which is that the fact that something doesn't appear isn't in fact proof of anything. Certainly not proof of a massive conspiracy. The problem that they all face is that all the positive evidence, by which I mean the evidence that really exists, bullets, the rifle, cartridge cases, palm prints, all of the positive evidence points directly to Oswald and points directly to the lone gunman theory. There's Tommy Lee Jones as Clay Shaw, his first appearance in this film. I love how Stone just sort of glances at him, and you feel like, well, maybe, what? Who is this person? What does this mean? And again, drawing you in, unfolding the mystery in a way so that you'll go with him over this really rather long. This director's cut runs 3.5 hours. The original ran about 3 hours flat, which I think was better. From what I remember, the theatrical version, the theatrical version was better. This is a bit bloated, I think, the 3.5 hour version, but it's the only one available and the only one that will be available, I think, for the foreseeable future. It's not appreciably different, but there's a bit of fat on it that I think could have been trimmed. Anyway, getting back to it, all the positive evidence points directly to Oswald. There's no positive evidence pointing to anybody else at all, And I always say, the bullets that killed Kennedy. The bullets came from this particular rifle. The rifle belonged to Oswald, and his palm print was on the weapon. That's an open and shut case. And I think a jury would have taken 2 hours tops to convict Oswald. It would have been faster than the O.J. Simpson trial, and maybe faster than the Garrison conspiracy trial that's portrayed here, where I think they acquitted Clay Shaw in 45 minutes or something like that. But they had Oswald dead to rights. There was no question, And Oswald knew it too, and Oswald played with that during those crucial 2 days when the world's eye was on him. Oswald had fun, and what Stone conjures here is mountains out of molehills. They're beautiful mountains, They're fascinating mountains to watch, but they're illusory. They don't exist. Where I think that to me, where the conspiracy theorists are very much, to me, in the same boat as people. I don't know why this comparison always occurs to me, but people who think that Christopher Marlowe wrote Shakespeare's plays, and they always say, well, this play wasn't registered until this date, and Shakespeare supposedly was in this place on this date and couldn't have registered it, therefore Marlowe must have written them. The problem is there's no positive evidence. There's no evidence, physical evidence of any kind, or positive evidence that Marlowe wrote any of Shakespeare's plays. There's no folio with Marlowe's name on it. There's no document with Marlowe's signature on it. There's nothing. It's all the positive evidence. The man, points to Shakespeare having written Shakespeare's plays. So again, it's mountains out of molehills, and it's amazing the people who should know better who think that Marlowe wrote Shakespeare's plays. Very prominent Shakespearean actors and directors, and historians, and yet there's nothing there. It's quite extraordinary. This is where I think the way this film is going to play out in terms of montage, really gets set in this scene. Where Jack Lemmon is telling his story, and interweaved into that are almost Rashomon-like reenactments in various film stocks, signaling to you what's the past, what's the present, what may have happened, what may not have happened. You know what I mean? And the collage nature of it points to the collage nature of the conspiracy theories, because there are all these various bits and pieces, these little nitpickings, these little slight indications that then, people then weave into a collage of the whole, and they think that some sort of larger picture emerges out of that. And very often it's just the mind seeing patterns that aren't there, as our brains are built to see patterns for various evolutionary reasons, and we see them even when they don't exist, And but it's how this film, the aesthetic of this film is very much how conspiracy theorists relate to these assassinations. There's David Ferrie over here, and there's the three tramps over here, and there's the anti-Castro intelligence operations over here, and the people draw them into this kind of these collages of non-existent connections, and build these extraordinary architectures out of them. I don't think there's any evidence that even Ferrie and Bannister knew each other, let alone that Bannister knew Oswald. I could be wrong about Ferrie and Bannister, but I don't think so. Garrison knew Bannister, but I don't think any of these people were actually connected in any way. Operation Mongoose, I don't think he had anything to do with that. Operation Mongoose, ironically, I believe, was run by Robert Kennedy, so which he never mentions here. Stone never bothers to mention that. So. Robert Kennedy did not believe there's any conspiracy involved in the killing of his brother. Some of Robert Kennedy's kids do. I think Robert Kennedy Jr., who's unfortunately is a conspiracy theorist himself and believes in anti-vaccine conspiracy theories and all this kind of rubbish. I think he does believe there was a conspiracy to kill both JFK and his father, but that's unfortunate. Anyone can go down that rabbit hole. Anyone can do it. So, yeah. Yeah, I have to say it can be, excuse me, it can be very exhausting arguing with conspiracy people. It just gets, when you start to go down that rabbit hole, and I think that happened with Stone, you buy into that worldview, and you get very moralistic about it, and you become extremely self-righteous because you think you know the truth and nobody else does. Not only that, but you've discovered this horrible evil that other people don't, and you want to fight it, and so you end up quite often doing some pretty horrible things. A lot of people who've committed mass shootings were conspiracy theorists, whether right-wing, a lot of right-wing violence is driven by conspiracy theory. Left-wing, the military-industrial complex idea here, drives left-wing violence quite often. It's the end game of it is very, very ugly, and I think ultimately rests, the end game of it often is the Elders of Zion. I mean, the first great conspiracy tract of the modern age was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and I think very, very often people end up, whether they're from the left or the right, they end up with Hitler. They end up with anti-Semitism. Stone himself has said some things that I would say at the very least sidled up to anti-Semitism and even Holocaust denial. Um, One of his major consultants here, L. Fletcher Prouty, I think was his name, was a far-right conspiracy theorist connected to anti-Semites, white supremacists, Holocaust deniers. And, Stone based the entire scene with Donald Sutherland off of him and his theories. So, you end up in bad places when you go down these rabbit holes. Conspiracy theories are not benign in any way. They're quite they're cancerous to the mind, and sometimes they lead to pretty horrible stuff in real life, So in that sense, when I say the film is in some ways a great evil film, I think that's where the evil lies. It gives you it gives people, it starts people down that rabbit hole, which was completely Stone's intention. I don't think it was a consciously malicious intention. I think he was right down that rabbit hole, But I don't think that I don't think it's a good thing to set people on that path, and to do it in such a powerful way. In a way, the film is so effective because of its evil. It's what makes the film powerful, what makes it brilliant in its way, is the passion of Stone's fanaticism. The power that this conspiracy beliefs give to Stone, the passion it creates in him, is what makes this film so powerful. John Candy is great here. I don't think there's any way to doubt. I think this may be his only dramatic role. He was a pretty big comedian in the 80s and early 90s, and unfortunately died very young. Obviously, I think his obesity was the reason, but he was a big star at the time, I have to say. And he's great in this, The real Dean Andrews, the guy that he's based on, from what I gather, was exactly like this. I mean, this is he was just this colorful, bizarre, somewhat corrupt New Orleans attorney, and the Clay Bertrand thing is nonsense. Andrews basically made it up, trying to look big, around the time of the Kennedy assassination. Oh, I'm going to go represent Oswald, and this guy Clay Bertrand called me, and it's all nonsense, And then Garrison seized on that and began his persecution of Clay Shaw, an innocent man, quite reprehensible. See, this is where I think the film does one of its veers off into silliness. It's like, oh, they're gonna kill me. Do I have to spell it out for you? There's about 9 or 10 times in this film when people say, "Do I have to spell it out for you?" And it's always before saying something completely ridiculous, And it's been used again and again in a million conspiracy movies and stuff like that. Someone says, "Do I have to spell it out for you?" It's become a hilarious cliche. But good day to you, sir. He is great. He really is. It's a shame he doesn't have more to do. This part here enters into one of the many controversial aspects of this movie, which is its homophobia. The character Kevin Bacon plays here is based off of Perry Russo, who was Jim Garrison's main witness, who was pretty thoroughly discredited for various reasons, and Garrison had him hypnotized and gave him sodium pentothal and stuff like that to get him to say what Garrison wanted him to say, which was, pretty par for the course. Anyway, this character is obviously homosexual, and I think he's a bit over the top here. The swish thing that Kevin Bacon does here. This film does, I think, put forward a fairly classic homophobic stereotype with these decadent, scheming homosexuals, in which their homosexuality is an expression of the corruption of their souls, basically. That in the same way, like Shakespeare's Richard III is hunchbacked because the deformity of his body indicates the deformity of his soul, is his evil, basically. These the deviant sexuality of these characters is an expression of the deviance of their intentions and their beliefs and their actions, and it's a bit I would say dated even. This is a kind of stereotype. I suppose in the time when Stone grew up, this was probably a fairly standard stereotype of a particular type of gay man, wealthy, really elite gay men. But I think even when at the moment this film came out, I think this was really sort of anachronistic and strange, and didn't go over very well at all. People really did protest it at the time. Stone didn't do a very good job of defending himself, quite frankly. His defense was basically like, well, they were all gay, so so I just portrayed it that way. It didn't go over very well. Stone has come in for criticism on the basis of both homophobia and misogyny. He's been accused of both, not entirely wrongly so, I think, in either case, but yeah, this is the story that Perry Russo told, I think, which is, insofar as we are aware, it's complete nonsense. It's never happened, Clay Shaw, Clay Shaw was the real victim, I think, of this whole affair. He was wealthy. He was gay. He was apparently a very talented man, a very adept businessman. And I don't know if he was a nice guy or not. I have no idea, but he was pretty widely admired and held in affection by his friends, and did I think managed to be a success at a time when it must have been very difficult to be. He was closeted, although I think it was a pretty open secret that he was gay. And it can't have been, I think he was actually probably a rather admirable guy, living that prominent a life and always facing the possibility of blackmail or being exposed, He was a big supporter of Kennedy, ironically. Very liberal man. And did a lot for the city of New Orleans, and had his life destroyed by Jim Garrison. And Garrison, in the end, couldn't convict him. Shaw was found innocent, but he suffered an enormous amount of financial hardship, and people do believe that Shaw died not too long after the trial. I think it was maybe 5 years or something after the trial, and there were people who felt that the trial took years off his life, and that he died. He died younger than he really should have. That's the view, and I think Shaw is really, along with Ferrie, is the real victim of the piece, and I think Stone compounds Garrison's sin by portraying them the way he does. I think it's very wrong what Stone did with those two men. It's a shame. As a drama, it works brilliantly. There's a nihilism to art. There isn't a sense that art has no morality. It will do what it does in order to be great art. It will, in order to achieve aesthetic greatness. It's perfectly willing to forego morality, and that's legitimate, I think, in its way. Richard III probably wasn't nearly as bad as Shakespeare portrayed him as. It doesn't really matter, because Richard III is an extraordinary piece of work, JFK is an extraordinary piece of work. It also is moral on a moral level reprehensible. I think particularly in the way that it portrays Shaw and Ferrie and the people it accuses of being the conspirators. Stone apparently took this word for word from rants that Perry Rousseau would have. Rousseau is a. It's interesting because Rousseau was a right wing fanatic, and so was Prouty, who was one of Stone's major sources. Mark Lane was a leftist, and it's interesting to me that conspiracy theories and this kind of extremism, there's a horseshoe effect where right and left sort of meet in the middle, and you find people on the far left and the far right agreeing on the evil of the military-industrial complex and government becoming too powerful. The government's coming for our guns, or the government is oppressing us through corporate power and things like that. Big business, hatred of big business, general populism. Things like that. You see it with the Trump phenomenon today. Trump, for example, his anti-war attitudes are perfectly compatible with the far left, and whether it's Waco or Jonestown on the right or the left, you see these cults form. Mark Lane was actually involved in the People's Temple and was present at the Jonestown massacre when they killed themselves and murdered their children, almost 1,000 people. So there's a really fascinating meeting point between left and right, and I don't categorize this film as left wing. I think this film is equally of the left and equally of the right. It's just it's those two extremes meeting, and they tend to meet quite powerfully around the Kennedy assassination. It's amazing to me. He may have been. It's amazing to me that Stone has never been on InfoWars. I mean, this movie's made for Alex Jones, who's very much of the far right. So I know that Stone's son has been on InfoWars, so there's an affinity there that's quite interesting. Because on the one hand, Stone goes and makes these hagiographic documentaries about Latin American leftists like Hugo Chavez, and then he goes and makes hagiographic documentaries about Vladimir Putin, who's seen as a hero of the right today, despite the legacy of the Soviet Union or whatever. Putin is a right-wing leader, completely a classic great Russian nationalist. So, there is a confluence that takes place on those extremes. It's really the moderate who's the enemy of the extremists, not the right that's the enemy of the left. When you get right down to it, it's the it's the normal people against the fanatics, I suppose you could say. It's the middle is a boring place to be, but it's sometimes healthier, particularly in politics. Here we go with Lee Bowers again, saying that he was murdered. Bowers died of natural causes. He was in a car accident. That's all there was to it. Nothing more than that. There's a couple of these scenes where there's sort of like conferences of his staff, which it's pretty amazing how they managed to pack so much information into these scenes and get it all across in such a short time without boring the viewer. I mean, these are classic Irving the Explainer scenes where these characters, as a script, when you saw this written in a script, this must have looked like death, just like excruciatingly boring. These just people sitting there babbling in a room. And yet with the montage, Stone makes it fascinating and exciting, And here we go into Oswald. I think this is, I can't remember if this is the scene that is intercut with the supposed forgery. Yeah, it is. This is great. But the way that Stone structures this, where you have three separate structures. You have them talking in the restaurant. You have the documentary stuff on Oswald. And then you have this person supposedly faking the backyard photographs. And the way that he intercuts all three of these things into a seamless whole it's really quite extraordinary. Yeah, this whole idea of creating Oswald's legend is it just there's mountains of evidence in regard to Oswald's trip to the Soviet Union. Um, all of it indicates that he was basically kind of a nut. He was I don't know what exactly you would call it. I think he was someone who wanted to escape his life, and he really had the mother from hell, and she was, she was someone you would definitely want to escape from. I think there was, if you like, a vaguely incestuous relationship between them. I think there's a strong possibility that she molested him. And he was a failure at school. He was a failure in the Marine Corps, and communism became a way for him to kind of get away and restart his life. And him believing that in doing so he could become a very significant person. So he went to Moscow, and I think the Russians, at least as far as we can tell, didn't really know what to do with him. Um, and they shunted him off to Minsk, I think, and they kept pretty strong tabs on him. There was over a dozen KGB operatives who had him under surveillance at various times, and he became, of course, disillusioned and left. And all the documentation supports that theory, not that he was any kind of a spy. Yeah. See, this is the thing. He wasn't really what you could call a defector. He didn't sort of hand himself over to the intelligence authorities and become a informant or anything like that. The CIA, the KGB, as far as I know, never even debriefed him. He was a kind of a pilgrim, a sort of ideological pilgrim. He never became a Soviet citizen, and they basically gave him a visa to stay, which I think was extended a couple of times. He was given sort of a long-term residence visa, but he was not really a defector. And I think that when he wanted to come back to the United States, there was not the feeling that this was a person who was a quote unquote traitor. This was a feeling that this was just some weird guy who went on this odd pilgrimage, and I don't think anyone really noticed him. That was Oswald's curse. No one noticed him throughout his life. And I think that's why he did it. Ultimately, I think that was his motive. People talk about it being an ideological motive, that he killed Kennedy because of Kennedy's sort of hard line on the Cold War, which Stone denies here, but which I think existed. And also uh, on behalf of Cuba, because of Kennedy's invasion of Cuba, and Oswald was a big supporter of Castro. Which is true, he was a big supporter of Castro, but I don't think that was the motive. I think the motive was summed up in what Oswald said to the police, which was, "Now everyone will know who I am." He made himself a significant person in the worst way. So, again, here, there's no evidence of CIA or other connections between any of Oswald's friends in the Russian community. The idea that it was weird that Oswald hung out with nothing but right wingers and anti communists is ridiculous. It's purely to the degree that the Russians who would have been in Texas at this time would all have been white Russians and would all have been right wingers. So those were the only people to hang out with, especially because with Marina Oswald wanting to find her some kind of community, and also Oswald himself being essentially an antisocial person, and so the only friends they would have been through Marina, and most of those would be Russian because she was Russian and didn't speak much English, and et cetera, et cetera. Again, there's no secret as to how he got the job at the book depository. It was through his Marina's friend Ruth Payne, and he wasn't really capable of anything else. The portrayal here of this is actually one of the only accurate portrayals of their relationship. Oswald was extremely abusive, and there were many, many witnesses to him being a violent and abusive person. And I don't think he loved Marina at all. I think he married her as a way to. I'm not sure. It may have been revenge on a girl he really did want to marry in Minsk, who turned him down, and he may have married Marina as a kind of vengeance. But I don't think he loved her at all, and so I think Marina's really a very sad case. Marina now believes there was a conspiracy. I think it's just that, conspiracy theorists have descended on her for so long and raised such sort of doubt in her mind that she, accepted that, not accepted, but it was easier for her to believe that it was a conspiracy. At the time, again, they're accusing her of being brainwashed by the FBI or the CIA. That's complete nonsense. She actually was one of the first to realize that it really was him, because the police went into the garage where Oswald kept his rifle, and he had it in a kind of burlap sack, and they asked her where the rifle was, and she pointed to it, and when the officer picked it up, it was limp because there was nothing in it. It was Oswald's rifle. He'd use it to kill JFK, and Marina knew at that moment that it was him, and said so, and that her mind was changed later by the various lunatics who descended on her. I mean, that's perfectly understandable. Yeah, the nitrate tests are nonsense. It was actually, first of all, it wasn't nitrate, it was a paraffin test, which were not admissible in court at the time, and were of extremely dubious accuracy. So that doesn't bear any weight. The palm print is a much bigger thing. This is hilarious because dead bodies don't sweat. So it wouldn't have been able to leave a fingerprint. As it's totally ridiculous. Not to mention the fact that it was on only a part of the rifle, which Stone does show. It's nonsense. As far as the FBI not seeing it, it had been lifted beforehand by the Dallas police, so that was why it didn't show up when the FBI examined it. Yeah, this was something Garrison actually said. Probably one of the most famous lines from the film. White is black and black is white. Yeah. Yeah, here we get into the Stone sort of reconstructs the shooting twice in this movie. It's first here in a sort of vague way, and then it's later in a more explicit way during the trial scene at the end. Um, it's well, he's massively stacking the deck because he only shows the people who said that it came from the grassy knoll. Uh, Nobody saw anything except for Mark Lane's claim about Lee Bowers. Uh, it's very difficult to get through because there's so much talk. There's so much sort of interweaved various testimonies, but several people saw Oswald fire the rifle. The most important one was a guy named Howard Brennan, who Stone doesn't in any way deal with here, and I think there's a good reason for that, which is that Brennan was not only saw Oswald but fired the gun, but got a very good look at him, and was the source of the description of Oswald that went out to police officers, which was the reason why Tippett stopped Oswald and was killed, and then the reason why a witness called the police when he saw Oswald going into the theater, the movie theater where he was arrested. Brennan had extremely good eyesight, and he was farsighted actually, with the result that he could see extremely well at distance. And people often think, well, Brennan had bad eyesight, so this is all a lie by the conspirators. Brennan was farsighted and could see extremely well at a distance, and he got an excellent look at Oswald. There was a guy standing beneath the. He was standing at the entrance to the book depository and heard the shots directly over him, looked up and saw the rifle sticking out of the Texas depository window, the sniper's nest window, and saw it fire. There were ear witnesses. There are ear witnesses all over the plaza. Um, Oh, I think this is the truck, the notorious truck with Jack Ruby. I think it's Jack Ruby who's supposedly that Stone portrays in the front. This truck has been found and accounted for, and all the people in it were accounted for. Yeah, it is Jack Ruby in the front. By the way, there's Jack Ruby's whereabouts at this time are accounted for. He was not anywhere near Dealey Plaza. And the truck was actually left the plaza before the shooting, and it's been found, and all the people in it are known, and this has nothing to do with anything. Um, to get back, there were three men who I think may not have been believed, may not have been considered quite credible at the time because they were all African American, and I think there may have been some prejudice against their testimony because of that. Um, they heard the shot. They heard three shots coming from directly over them. They were on the fifth floor. Oswald was on the sixth floor. And when Oswald fired, they heard all three shots, and they knew that they were coming from directly overhead. And they actually heard the sound of the bolt being worked during the shooting. So it's pretty clear that the shots came from where the Warren Commission said they came from. This woman here is a kind of, standard sort of eccentric nut. She's changed her story over and over and over again, and her excuse for having changed it is that she was intimidated, or that that her testimony was fabricated or changed, and all this other stuff, and her story's changed multiple times over the decades, and I don't think she's most what I would call sane researchers don't consider her credible, and I don't consider her credible. So Stone is both stacking the deck, and I think he's just grabbing the various sort of testimonies that conspiracy theorists use, and without evaluating them for their veracity. Stone is not a historian. He doesn't know. He doesn't have the training. He doesn't know how to evaluate sources, and he just sort of threw them all together. I don't think there's anything more mysterious than that. So. They're about to go here into the idea that you couldn't. This woman also. Her claim that Oswald, Ruby, and Ferrie knew each other. There's no evidence of that whatsoever, except her claim about it. I believe she's also changed her story many times, and she's just kind of seized upon. By the conspiracy theorists, and I'm not saying I don't want to impugn her character, but I think that people like the attention, and you make friends in the conspiracy theory community, and it almost becomes kind of like a cult. There's this constant reinforcement of you and your story, and a constant sort of you become more and more an object of praise, and you're really valued as a person in the conspiracy theory community, and I think that has its psychological effect, and stories change, and stories get exaggerated, and you start to learn what versions of the story work with audiences, and I don't think it's necessarily a conscious lie. I think it's something you sort of slowly fall into, Here we get a little bit into this idea of killing witnesses. That's less emphasized now, I think, But immediately after the not immediately, but into the sort of late 60s, early 70s, it became a big talking point among conspiracy theorists that supposedly witnesses were being knocked off. It was fed by an article in I think The Guardian, British newspaper. I believe it was in The Guardian. I'm not sure. That said that the odds of this many witnesses dying in this sort of time frame was something like, a billion trillion to one or something, some ridiculous number. Okay, this is important, I think, because it really shows how Stone cooked the books. Ruby did say more or less what he's saying here, but they basically took a sort of tiny piece out of his whole statement. Ruby said very clearly to the Warren Commission that there was no conspiracy, and he wanted to come to Washington to testify that there was no conspiracy. So, they basically sort of... This, I have a hard time believing that Stone wasn't being consciously dishonest here. I do think he sincerely believes there was a conspiracy, but I think that to serve his ends, he did do some dishonest things, and I think this is one of them, because it's very clear that Ruby didn't think there was a conspiracy from this statement. He did think that Ruby was going a bit mad at the end of his life. Well, first of all, I don't think he ever intended to serve a day in jail, and I think what had happened to his life after he shot Oswald was deranged him a bit. And he thought there was a campaign underway to kill the Jews, and that Jews were being murdered in the basement of the jail where he was, and unfortunately, I do think he was a bit round the bend, and yet still denied there was a conspiracy, and unquestionably died of natural causes. So I do think that's Stone being quite dishonest. I've sort of already talked about this. The 5.6 seconds is not a figment of Stone's imagination, but the Warren Commission never made an absolute determination of the amount of time that it took to fire the shots. I think that, again, the sane researchers have calculated that it was somewhere between sort of 5.5 and 8 seconds, I think, is the general idea. Depends when the shooting started, because it's pretty clear when the shooting ended. It ended with that horrible headshot to Kennedy. But it's not entirely clear when the shooting began, although there's some interesting evidence as far as that. There's a young girl... By the way, when they really rank on the Mannlicher Carcano rifle, it's quite untrue. It was a copy of an M1 rifle, I think, that the U.S. used in World War II. It's accurate at up to half a mile. It's a perfectly serviceable weapon. There's nothing. It's not obviously a sort of. It's not this. The greatest sniper rifle in the world at the time, but it's perfectly viable to use as a. It could certainly do the shooting that Oswald did. There's a fascinating actually thing in the Zapruder film where as Kennedy's car goes into the grassy knoll, not the grassy knoll, as it goes past the road sign, there's a little girl who's running towards the car to sort of run parallel with the car, and at a certain point she stops and she turns directly towards the Texas Book Depository, and they actually found the girl, I think, and she said, yeah, I heard a shot, and I turned, and I felt it was coming from the depository. This is where Stone starts to confabulate his idea of the perfect assassination. It's the idea of the L-shaped ambush and the triangulated fire and stuff like that. Again, there's no evidence of it. And now you could say this is the way that you would kill the president, and it may well be. It could be that the perfect ambush in Dealey Plaza was triangulated field of fire, but there's no evidence. There's no guns. There's no bullets. There's no sightings. There's no suspects. All the positive evidence points to Oswald, and not to. Yeah, that is really quite powerful. The way that Stone manipulates the Zapruder film in this scene is very powerful. The Zapruder film's really. Some people say it was the first snuff film, although I believe that snuff films are an urban myth. There's a there's a theory that it really changed the portrayal of violence in American media and things like that. I'm not entirely convinced of that because it wasn't shown for about 10 years before it was before it. In other words, it's not entirely true that it was suppressed from the American people. The frames were printed in Life magazine. A series of frames were printed in Life magazine shortly after the assassination, except for the headshot, which is what the conspiracy theorists go crazy about. And why was the headshot withheld? The headshot was withheld because it was too horrible. And they weren't willing to print that in a quote unquote family magazine. And you have to remember the standards of the time. The media did not show the kind of explicit violence that is shown in the media today, whether in news or in fictional media. It's there was the sensitivities, also the Kennedy family, and I do have to admit that I think that the Kennedy family and the concerns of the Kennedy family to maintain JFK's dignity after the shooting did lead to a lot of playing fast and loose. No, that's the wrong thing to say. But it did lead them to do and to request certain things that conspiracy theorists would later seize on. Maybe the most famous one is when Stone has this moment in the film where in the trial, Garrison says the president's brain has disappeared, and the crowd goes, "Oh!" Robert Kennedy interred the brain in JFK's grave in Arlington, and did so really without asking permission from anybody. He just kind of did it. And that was done out of deference to the Kennedy family. And, of course, conspiracy theorists have seized on that. Another one is the autopsy, where Bobby Kennedy really demanded that they rush the autopsy and make it as perfunctory as possible, which, again, conspiracy theorists have grabbed on and all that. So, in a way, the Kennedy family contributed inadvertently and for the best of reasons, in ways that have inspired conspiracy theorists, for decades, and probably always will. This stuff about fake Oswalds. First of all, I mean, the solution to them is perfectly clear. Either they actually were Oswald, or people were mistaken. It's really pretty simple, I mean, eyewitness evidence is the least reliable form of evidence, and in the weeks after the assassination, everybody thought they'd seen Oswald somewhere, or whether they made it up or whether it was a legitimate mistake. There's a million reasons why. And then these stories get exaggerated, and and it becomes, well, who were the three Oswalds? And it just becomes ridiculous, Yeah, these are all sort of, it's all anecdotal, there's no hard evidence. There's no positive evidence that any of these things actually happened, so, there's not much you can really do with it, Certainly not evidence of a CIA plot to sort of spread fake Oswalds all over Dallas and New Orleans and wherever, Florida. So it's Frank Whaley, who was in a lot of Stone films at this time, and is actually a very good actor. I think it's a shame he never really continued on to something bigger. Oswald definitely was in Mexico, and he definitely went to the Mexican embassy. As for why, the photograph thing, they got it wrong. Someone put the wrong name on it. Who knows, But there's no doubt that Oswald was in Mexico for a certain amount of time and did want to go to Cuba. I think that was his next attempt to remake his life. That was going to be, and the Cubans didn't want him. And that may have been the moment at which his mind turned to assassination. You know, another thing that Stone doesn't mention. And here we go into the photo thing. The photos have been authenticated beyond question, and several times. But I think the latest one using I don't know if it's digital technology per se, but sort of the latest photographic analysis technology has shown that it's unquestionably genuine. It has to do with the difference in the film grain when you doctor a photograph like that. Then the thing that you matte onto it, there's a difference in the film grain between the piece that's matted in and the original photograph. So, it's pretty simple. There's no real question about that. That's the kind of thing Oswald said to the cops during the whole 2 days that he was in custody. He basically said stuff like, "Well, you figure it out," and "Well, that's what you say," and "Well, I don't know about that." These guys, he just deflected basically. He actually didn't deny outright all that much, from what I understand. He did say, that no, I didn't, I wasn't here, I didn't do it. But for a lot of things, he deflected, and he just sort of said, "Well, that's what you think, you cops figure it out," stuff like that. He was playing games. He was having fun, I think, and I imagine really enjoying it. I think Oswald had a lot of fun in those last 2 days of his life. He'd gotten what he always wanted. The attention of the world. The whole world was looking and talking just about him. Again, the Clay Bertrand didn't exist. He was a figment of Dean Andrews' imagination, and they never could find a connection to Shaw, but they got Perry Russo to lie about it. So, I do think the portrayal here of Sissy Spacek's characters, of Garrison's wife, is, Stone has been talked about. He's been accused of misogyny, and I think he does play her as a kind of mousy, cowardly woman who's always trying to undermine her husband, and I don't think it's very. I don't know if it's fair or not. She may have been like that, but I think that's Stone. Writing out his own neuroses, into his film. I was going to say is that the one thing Stone never talks about is that in this film, and the most important thing maybe that he never talks about, is that Oswald had tried to do it before. He tried to kill a very right-wing racist general named Walker, and he'd fired through the man's window and almost killed him. The bullet deflected off, I think, the window sash, and just missed Walker, who was fairly prominent in politics in Dallas and was a very racist, really a reprehensible guy. There's no question. Racist, segregationist, reactionary, right-winger. And Oswald failed to kill him, and it was a kind of dress rehearsal for the shooting of JFK, and I think one of the best indicators of Oswald's intention to be an assassin, and also the fact that there was a certain amount of ideological. There was an ideological aspect to it. He was hunting fascists, as Stone writes in this film. And it's the best indication to my mind that Oswald was involved. That Oswald did it. At least, let me put it this way, it's a prior bad act that's very indicative of guilt. It's not the best evidence. The best evidence is the physical evidence. But nonetheless, I think the fact that Stone erases the attempt on Walker's life from this film, I think says a great deal. Says a very great deal. I've talked about it a bit already, but the portrayal of Shaw in this film is really quite despicable. Tommy Lee Jones got an Oscar nomination not deservedly, in my opinion. I think Tommy Lee Jones is a great actor, but I think he plays, as Kevin Bacon does, he plays this character in such a sort of like, swish, stereotypically gay sort of way. When he says at the end, "Oh, I shall go have some eggs buffet." I mean, it's ridiculous. I think it's very campy. This whole sequence is extremely campy, and also homophobic. This idea that there was this homosexual cabal, to kill the president. Garrison was obsessed with that, and actually said, it was, he originally said, which Stone doesn't mention for good reason. Garrison originally said that it was a quote unquote homosexual thrill killing, relating it back to Leopold and Loeb, who were young, two young murderers who killed a young boy, and were homosexuals. That was back in the 1920s, yeah, I must confess a weakness now and then. It's very stereotypical. This wouldn't fly today. It almost didn't fly back then. There was some substantial criticism of this film as homophobic. But today, I mean, you'd never get away with this today. No chance in hell. It's stereotypical, to say the least. To portray sort of upper class, slightly effeminate homosexuals as malevolent villains is very very much a classic sort of homophobic stereotype. This is where it gets really bad. It's just so ridiculous. I think this is the part where Tommy Lee Jones painted gold. Yep, there it is. I mean, this is beyond camp. This is just absurd. And the poppers, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? This is just ridiculous. Supposedly, there was the claim made that Clay Shaw had actually been seen painted in gold. That is not true. He was wearing some sort of he was dressed up in a costume or something for Mardi Gras. That was all, really. Yeah, this just gets totally out of control. I mean, this is so over the top and campy, and it's quite ugly, really. I think, and I certainly understand why gay people were upset by this, and I think that Garrison himself, the real Garrison, did use it as a way to, as proof of guilt. He said, these guys are all connected, even though there was no evidence connecting Shaw to Ferrie or any of these other people. He said that, well, they must be connected because they're all homosexuals. As if being homosexual inherently made you a conspirator, inherently made you an assassin, or a traitor. It was pretty low. Garrison went very, very low, as low as he could, I think. And Stone unfortunately followed him down that rabbit hole. This newspaper report came from a communist newspaper that regularly impugned American businessmen as CIA agents. There's no truth to it whatsoever. There was a small connection between Shaw and the CIA. Shaw was interviewed, debriefed even isn't the right word, is too strong a word. He was interviewed by the CIA, I think on a couple of occasions, because he was an international businessman and he traveled a lot. And when he would come back from various places overseas, he would be interviewed by the CIA, as I'm sure tens of thousands of other such businessmen were. He was never a contract agent. He was never involved in any kind of espionage. And that was the size of it. Shaw was a patriot, I think. I think that Shaw quite willingly and happily, talked to the CIA. This part here. That Stone treats this basically as, Shaw's confession. Shaw never in any way said that he was an agent to the CIA or anything like that, This to me also shows Stone's leaps in logic. Um, Stone at this point basically assumes that Shaw is guilty, and Garrison, in terms of Kevin Costner, you know, uh, now knows that now suddenly has leapt to the point that Shaw is guilty, even though he's seen no evidence, he's seen anything of that kind. Yeah, this part here, murder, an act of patriotism to murder his own president. I mean, suddenly Garrison is there. It's a flaw in the writing, I think. There's a leap made that we haven't worked up to. You know, and it's also Stone, I think, expressing his own self-righteousness. As often happens with people who believe in conspiracy theories, they become ultra moralistic and very, quite frankly, very unpleasant to be around. You know. Here we go into one of the domestic scenes. I think all the domestic scenes in this film are pretty bad. I think, quite frankly, that Stone was, well, he got divorced shortly after this film was made, so I think he was expressing his own. He was reading his own script, I think, when he wrote these scenes, and you know, and I think is getting out some of his rather negative feelings about his wife. Yeah. This may also be Stone talking about how his absence from his family while he was making films. I once saw an interview with his son who said that his father really wasn't around uh, in this time when he was sort of on that run of really good movies that he made in the late 80s and early 90s. I think his son said that he really wasn't around, and I think this is probably an expression of that. Semi autobiographical, as they say. Shaw must have gotten him on our tail. Oh my god, so ridiculous. I mean, this was inevitably going to come out. An investigation like this on such a notorious subject. I mean, there was no way to keep it secret forever. The idea that Shaw, tipped off the press or something is just absurd. But Stone's got to throw it in, because you have to feel that there's the all-powerful force running everything. That's a standard conspiracy theory theme, is that everything is being caused by manipulative outside forces. So everything has to be attributed to that. And Shaw is the CIA, which is the global cabal, which is the conspiracy that killed Kennedy, which is the military industrial complex, whatever. Yeah. Everything has to be run by them. This is not true. Garrison actually got private money. He got donations from several wealthy people to continue his investigation, which was not illegal at the time, but I'm not sure it's illegal now. It would never happen today. It would be considered massively unethical for private sources to finance a public investigation. So, yeah, we're about to go into an absolutely brilliant scene here. A tour de force by Joe Pesci. Yeah. Pesci can do intensity better than almost any other actor, and he can go over the top better than almost any other actor. I personally don't think there's anything inherently wrong with going over the top if you do it right, and Pesci almost always did it right. You know, he always walked that line so brilliantly. Yeah. This is also one of Stone's big lies in this movie. Ferrie never did this. Ferrie never confessed to anything. Ferrie never, he never got in a hotel room with Garrison and said, oh, I did it, and goes on this long rant, about who was involved. But nonetheless, although it's totally fictional, this is a fantastic scene. Again, I really see Pesci as I may have said the James Cagney of our time. He had that ability to just sustain this ferocious energy, and keep it going, and be very stylized, but never to be ridiculous or to come off as clownish or anything like that. And the way that Pesci sustains the scene for quite a long time and with a lot of dialogue is really quite extraordinary, I think. There's no evidence that Ferrie was in the CIA in any way. Yeah, black. I mean, the way he stylizes certain lines is so memorable. It really sticks in your head. And at the end, when he kind of breaks down, which is really right on that line between camp and pathos, I think he manages to just pull it off. And it's quite something to behold. Highest clearance is all nonsense. That Shaw didn't have, wasn't even an agent, let alone have highest clearance. It's also untrue. Ruby was not a bagman for anybody. Williams's score here is great. I think these kind of knocking, almost calypso drums. This kind of percussion. This gives it a great sense, and also sort of evokes Cuba a little bit, I think, where he starts talking here about Operation Mongoose. It indicates a kind of Central American or feel to it. I don't think quoting Churchill with it. Oh, that's great. And here's where he goes right up to the edge, I think, when he says and he says this line. Yeah. There were people who laughed at this when I saw this in the theater, and it does sort of minutely cross that line into camp, and then I feel like it comes back when he says, I started to lose everything." I think it becomes very affecting. I think it becomes very powerful. And then he gets very quiet, very calm. The dynamism of it is fantastic, and Pesci pulls it off. Pesci actually, he doesn't get much of a chance to do it, but he's great at underplaying. I mean, if you watch The Irishman, where he's very. I don't think he raises his voice once in the whole movie, and he's very quiet, very unobtrusive, in that film, and it's beautifully underplayed. But at this point, I think he was much adored for his energy. This was right after Goodfellas, and where he's this fantastic, ferocious performance in Goodfellas, and I think people wanted that. He's very much James Cagney in Goodfellas. I mean, it's very clear that's what Scorsese was after. It's important to note that the media did give Garrison a chance. They were very interested in his investigation, and it did get a lot of publicity. And it was only later when the real story about Garrison started to come out that the media, quote unquote, turned against him. I'm not sure they turned against him so much as they just reported the truth. Yeah, now we're about to go into the Al Fletcher Prouty part, which I think is maybe one of the most extraordinary sequences. I won't say in film history, but in certainly the films of this era. Let's say the late '80s, early '90s. Pretty extraordinary stuff. What the next sequence we're going to come to? Yeah, Garrison, of course, claimed that he was bugged. You know, Frankly, they probably should have bugged him with what he was up to. I don't know if they did or not. It's possible, I suppose, that the FBI bugged him or something, keep tabs on him. And quite frankly, they were smart to do so if they did do it. Oh no, there's a scene right. Okay, there's a scene with Ferrie's death before he goes to Washington. Again, this thing of the sinister assassinations of witnesses and stuff. This sequence creeped me out when I first saw this. These icons, the paintings, and and the score too. This very creepy score. The rats, scurrying around in the cages. This I found incredibly unnerving when I first saw this film. Ferry died of completely natural causes. This claim that he overdosed on anything is nonsense. And even if he had taken like a bottle full of Proloid, it certainly wouldn't have killed him quickly. Set is great. I think really a terrific piece of art direction. It really expresses the character of that they've created of David Ferrie, the fictional character that they created out of him. It's really expressed, I think, in this set. You know, it's a bit of a cheat, yeah, that he shows Ferry being killed, but I think in this case you can sort of give Stone a little leeway because it's like it's Garrison imagining it. It's Garrison sort of thinking, well, in this scenario, what would it have looked like? And so but I think you can quite easily go the other way and say, well, this is Stone explicitly depicting that Ferry was murdered. Kind of go other way on that point. Although, and there are points where Stone sort of gives himself the out, and one of the characters says, well, let's speculate, shall we? And something like that. But uh, these weren't suicide notes. They were just things that he was writing at the time. You know, None of them said, that he was going to kill himself or anything like that. I think his apartment was littered with writings of all kinds. So again, that's not true. He wouldn't have died quick. Probably wouldn't have even had any immediate effect, from what I've read. And I do think Garrison had some responsibility for Ferrie's death. The stress of pressuring the guy to testify or to turn to testify to something he didn't know and turn on someone who he didn't know and knew wasn't guilty. Brought on the aneurysm that killed him. What Stone's doing here is setting up the Bill Broussard character, the Michael Rooker character, as the reason Garrison loses the trial later on. That this character betrays him. It's much less clear in the theatrical version, but it's much more clear in this director's cut that Michael Rooker's character betrays Garrison, and that's why Garrison loses the trial at the end. And he's starting to set this up, like here, and this guy's saying, we know that Castro really did it and stuff like that, which is, I think, also Stone trying to debunk one of the arguments made by certain conspiracy theorists who say that the government covered it up because they were afraid of World War III starting over this. God knows. I mean, you go down these rabbit holes and there's so many things, that some conspiracy theorists don't agree with other conspiracy theorists, and they see the other conspiracy theorists as conspiracy theorists, whereas they know that. I mean, it just, it's endless. It's absolutely endless. But this is all Stone stacking the deck on his behalf and on Garrison's behalf in a very silly way, I think. Yeah, here it is. Here we go into, I think, an absolutely extraordinary piece of cinema. And Donald Sutherland is fantastic in it. The way that he just sustains this immense monologue. I mean, this must have been 10 pages worth of dialogue, and just keeps rolling it out and keeps you fascinated, aided by he really aids Stone's montage, and the two of those together, his performance and the editing, just create something truly extraordinary. Unfortunately, it's also complete bullshit. Every word of it. This is basically L. Fletcher Prouty, who is a prominent conspiracy theorist, fabulist, former member of the U.S. military. Although whether he was as high-ranking or as in the loop as he claims, I sort of doubt. But Prouty is again, it shows you the interesting confluence in this film between left and right. Prouty is a far right person connected to white supremacist groups, connected to anti-government, right-wing sort of anti-government militia-style groups, anti-Semitic groups, Holocaust denial groups, and has been very, very much a figure of the extreme right, the sort of Alex Jones right, the Timothy McVeigh right, you could say, and Stone became a great friend of his, and I think accepted everything he had to say as gospel, and I think Prouty became a kind of hero to Stone. Stone really admired him, as a human being, and it's very strange. It's very strange. I think he became a kind of father figure to Stone, who had a very fraught relationship with his own father, and I think that there may have been a psychological aspect there. So, yeah, this is all Prouty's theory of why Kennedy was killed. This is where things go into this is where things get into really egregious distortions. Kennedy never had a plan to withdraw all American troops by 1965. What Stone is talking about here is a report by Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, and another, it might have been Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, although I'm not sure. Anyway, him and another major cabinet member had gone to Vietnam and done a fact-finding mission. And what ironically, what they said was that Vietnam was doing actually very well, and the military situation was improving. And they sent Kennedy a memo saying that we should remove, because the military situation is improving so much, we should remove 1,000 men by this year, and by 1965 have all of our people out. Kennedy then, McGeorge Bundy then, I believe, issued what National Security Action Memo 362, I think, maybe? I have the number wrong, probably. But that's which Stone talks about here. And then this, by the way, this thing with Oswald's profile is purely due to the time difference. This was not a plant, by the CIA or anything like that. Now, that memo 362 or whatever it was, basically said the president expressed approval of the recommendations made by the Secretary of Defense, and so it was basically Kennedy saying, I agree with McNamara's report, McNamara's recommendations. It's very clear, though, that McNamara's recommendations were based entirely on the viability of the military situation. In other words, as long as things were going well, we should plan to do this long term, which had always been the plan. There had always been the idea that we go in, we help improve the military situation. As soon as South Vietnam can stand on its own 2 feet, we leave, or at least mostly leave. So it was not Kennedy saying, we're going to pull out of Vietnam. It was Kennedy saying, since things are getting better, we can start the process of withdrawal. The reason why Johnson later sent in troops is that the military situation significantly deteriorated. And then you get to the Tet Offensive and things really start to go to hell, and but this is the essence of Stone's case. This, by the way, is all nonsense in regard to the security procedures. The security procedures were perfectly normal, and in fact, the Army unit that was supposedly told to stand down actually did collaborate somewhat with the Secret Service in protecting the president. There was no egregious violation of protection codes or anything like that. So, there was a security failure. There's no question. The Secret Service was in a bad way when they, in terms of their security protocols. They, they definitely they'd gotten complacent. I think there hadn't been an assassination of a chief executive since I think 1901. So there was, I think, an air of arrogance and unrealism, or even just to kind of, they didn't realize it could happen. And it was kind of like 9/11. It was beyond their imaginations at the time. It was a failure of imagination. They couldn't conceive of something like this happening, and when it did, again, it's the kind of black swan event. It's the unknown unknown, as Donald Rumsfeld would put it, and as a result, the measures were not in place, which could have protected Kennedy. Things like the bubble top being off the car were done at Kennedy's request. He wanted to see the crowd and to have the crowd see him. And that was how things were done back then, and there'd never been a problem before. And, they couldn't... it was beyond their conception in terms of a man with a high-powered rifle, It shouldn't have been, but unfortunately it was, Bureaucratic inertia and organizational, apathy and all those things that happen in big companies. Anyway, getting back to the National Security Action Memo, it goes to the heart of Stone's claim that, which is essentially that Kennedy was killed because he was going to pull out of Vietnam, which would have meant a lot of very powerful people would have lost a lot of money and a lot of power. The military-industrial complex would have lost out. I'm sure Kennedy wanted to get out of Vietnam. Johnson wanted to get out of Vietnam. Everybody wanted to get out of Vietnam. Nobody wanted to be there, I think that it's not so much whether Kennedy wanted to get out of Vietnam as the fact that I think Kennedy, as the military situation deteriorated in Vietnam, as it certainly would have in whoever was president, I think he would have found it very, very difficult to withdraw in the way that McNamara recommended. I think it would have been politically impossible for him to do so, and he would have escalated the war in the same way that Johnson did, with the same deleterious consequences. Yeah, again, this is all Prouty. I mean, we have only Prouty's word for any of this. Yeah, I think that the people who try, in retrospect, to say that Kennedy would have gotten out of Vietnam, or are really trying to save Kennedy's reputation. They want to believe. They want to believe a couple of things. A, they want to believe that Kennedy was a great president and a great man. Two, they want to believe that getting out of Vietnam is the right thing to do, and it only would have required a different president in order to do it. And I think that those two combined, and they want Kennedy to be right. They want JFK to have been right about his policies and so forth. But I don't think Kennedy could have gotten out of Vietnam politically. It would have been impossible for him at that time, certainly. And he would have been out of office in any case by the Tet Offensive. His 2 terms would have been done by 1968. So there wouldn't really have been a reason for him, but to if I can say, to face the there wouldn't have been a reason for him to get out, because the descent of the military situation into Tet would have predicated him would have demanded him staying inside. This is where we get into very standard left-wing conspiracy theories. The idea of the intelligence services fomenting covert actions abroad and overthrowing countries, and keeping, bringing that then to the United States and imposing a kind of secret oligarchy or a secret fascism over the United States. That's a pretty standard new left trope to this day. The far left embraces that idea. Here we go into the argument: who benefits, which the Sutherland character eventually says is more important than the question of who did what from where. Who benefits is the main question. Cui bono. That's an appealing idea. It just happens to be a logical fallacy. Just because someone benefits doesn't mean they did anything to engineer that benefit. There's no logical connection between the two. If someone is murdered and their relative or their son or daughter inherits their money, that doesn't mean the son or daughter committed the murder. You'd need physical evidence. You'd need witnesses. You'd need real. You'd need some real substance connecting them to the murder. You can't just say, well, they must have done it because they inherited the money. That doesn't fly in court, and it doesn't fly logically. So this whole argument is fallacious that Stone's making here through this character. Now we're about to see what is not one of the CIA's finest hours, but I think Reinhold Gehlen appears here. Yeah. This German accented guy, I think, is meant to be Reinhold Gehlen, who was a Nazi intelligence chief on the Eastern Front during World War II, and was, after the war, was spirited out by the CIA and used to run its anti-communist operations in Eastern Europe, or at least to run some of them. Not the CIA's finest hour, and used over and over again by leftists to say that the U.S. was actually taken over by Nazis after World War II and is essentially a Nazi nation. That's, it gets expanded into a huge conspiracy theory, and it is the conspiracy theory that Stone is working off here, to a great extent. So Gehlen's important, even though he's not, as a focal point for the conspiracy theorists, or at least the left-wing conspiracy theorists. I imagine the right-wing conspiracy theorists probably rather like Gehlen. He's right up their alley, So... And I got to say, the guy who plays Johnson here is pretty good. He really does look like him, even though he's mostly shot in shadow, but he really does look like him. I do think this is very dramatic. I think this is pretty captivating. What he says is it was in the wind. It was just, you know. Again, you know, this is obviously plausible, I suppose. Although I don't think it really is because the the conspiracy that he's pointing to here is smaller than the conspiracy he points to elsewhere. Because the totality of the conspiracy he's talking about uh, encompasses everything from the Dallas police to the mafia to New Orleans homosexuals, the homosexual cabal in New Orleans, to big business, to the military-industrial complex, to Lyndon Johnson. I mean, everybody essentially is involved, And then he says, no, it's just actually this small cellularized rogue element in the CIA or in the defense establishment. So it's Stone basically. He's positing two separate ideas, one slightly more plausible than the other. But I still don't think it's this compartmentalized assassination idea is particularly plausible in the end. It's something that conceivably maybe could have happened. The problem is there's no evidence that it did. That's the main thing. Again, there's no positive evidence. Again, there was no withdrawal policy. That's the main thing. That's what's important to remember. The Vietnam War. Yeah. It is great writing, you gotta say, and beautifully delivered by Sutherland. It's very dramatic, very powerful. It really, it really gets to you and sticks with you. I mean, it's quite remarkable. It's interesting to me that would be seen as being very left wing, but what Sutherland's saying here actually is essentially very right wing. It's fascism, really. This idea that society's power rests in its war powers and all the rest of it. That's the theory of fascism. Everything is authority. Everything is power. There is no morality. It's the will to power. It takes you to dark places. What's being posited here? You know, because he's asserting it's an absolute. He's not saying, "Oh, it's wrong that it's this way and we should change things." He's saying, "No, society's power is based in its war powers. It's based in its capacity for war. That's the central organizing principle of society." Is what he says, word for word, is war, violence. That's fascism. You know, that's the belief in the rectitude of fascism, is that fascism is in accordance with with nature. You know, this is how things are supposed to be. Power is everything. Authority is everything. You ironically, the left, through people like Foucault, has also embraced that. And it's not surprising to me. There's a confluence between the left and the right on that issue in terms of power and what power expresses in society. In terms of power being society, essentially. Society is power and nothing else. That's Foucault and that's Hitler. It's although I'm not saying Foucault is as evil as Hitler or anything like that, but there's a kinship there that's very disconcerting, very frightening. There's Kennedy's grave. I've seen it. It's a very moving place. In some ways, Robert Kennedy's grave is even more moving. It's a pool, a small reflective pool next to JFK's grave, and it's very peaceful, very beautiful. Arlington Cemetery is a very moving place, must be said. Yeah, Shaw being in this bathrobe and the cigarette holder. It's all very camp. Yeah, Shaw said that he never gave this alias. The judge ruled it inadmissible in court and said that he didn't believe the officer who claimed to have written it down. Um, I believe that he never said it. I think Garrison fabricated this evidence. I have no doubt about that. Because he didn't have anything to do with it. There's plenty of people I'm sure that they spoke to who were not mentioned in the Warren report. And here's Jim Garrison as Earl Warren, Stone Getty in his digs, giving it a twisting the knife, if you like. It is kind of funny. I mean, you have to admit, it's pretty good. I mean, if you wanna, hit them with irony, that's the right way to do it. you know. Yeah, here's the Mr. Smith goes to the assassination bit. This is right wing stuff. This is very right wing stuff. Far right, Government, is the government worth preserving? The heavens fall. Yeah, I mean, that's. I think it's very far right stuff as much as it's far left. Everything that is portrayed here. This is a fake news, obviously a fake news report, and it is Stone sort of trying to stack it, in his favor. But everything that's actually said here is true. Garrison did bribe and intimidate and drug and hypnotize witnesses to get them to say what he wanted. Anyway, I do think though, as far as it being right wing, it is. That's obviously there, but I do think on the left, um, I do think there is on the part of the left a need, a desire on 2 points. One is to demonize the government so they can overthrow it. They can legitimize overthrowing it. I'm talking about the far left now. They can legitimize overthrowing it in favor of a left wing government. So therefore, I think that's why guys like Mark Lane seized on this as a conspiracy theory, you know. But I think the second reason is that they cannot accept that Kennedy was killed by a leftist and that Oswald was a communist, you know, and in a way, if you like, was one of their own, you know, whose views on the world, pro Castro, you know, anti Cold War, things like that, weren't necessarily too far from their own views, you know. And I think that they've never really reckoned with that, and that's why I think conspiracy theories like this are common on the left. They're common on the right for other reasons, but they're common on the left because I think of that, of who Oswald was and what Oswald believed. You know, that's terribly difficult, I think, for people on the far left to accept. Maybe even some people on the mainstream left to accept. You know. It's rather like what happened when yeah, and here it ties into he's going to charge then that King and Bobby Kennedy were also killed by the same conspiracy. So yeah, I don't think that was it. I think the series of assassinations in the U.S. it happened rather like school shootings, which some on the far right, Alex Jones, claim are conspiracies. You know, but I think it was I think it happened because of the piggyback effect, the copycat effect, and that these things become normalized, and as a result, they happen more often. People begin to find them acceptable in a sick way. You know, school shootings. You know, one begets the other. You know, and in fact, school shooters, you know, will say, "I was inspired by this school shooting." The Columbine. They'll often cite the Columbine school shooting as a reason. As a justification or as something an inspiration, I think is the right word for what they did. So it isn't surprising to me that political assassinations inspired or normalized other political, or at least made certain disturbed people think that this was now possible, you know, in the 1960s, you know. And there was also, they never mentioned, there was an attempt to kill George Wallace, who was very right wing, not a revolutionary leader in that sense, a reactionary, and two attempts to kill Gerald Ford, who can hardly be described as a flaming radical, So Ford, ironically, was on the Warren Commission. This, I think, is very much Stone's own marriage disintegrating. I think he's presenting it for us. It's all quite maudlin, really. I don't find it very. I think it's really Stone's concession to sort of all Americanism, trying to portray Garrison as a saint, as a Jimmy Stewart character, basically, and him sort of reaching into the cliches of old Hollywood, if you like. Although old Hollywood, I think, did it a lot better. This is really a kind of copy of a copy of a copy. And also in these scenes, him trying to get across, his own, marital problems, really. They're actually quite good in it, though, I think. Both Spacek and Costner. I think they're very good. They're doing their best with with what they've got, It's funny because he was attacking him for being homosexual, at least in part. It's very powerful when Costner sort of slightly breaks down because he's very much has that image of the kind of all-American man's man, And when he seems to be almost on the verge of tears, I think it's very powerful. It's very moving. I think it's very moving. It's very affecting. He was one of the few actors of his era that still had that kind of man's man, all-American. I mean, if you were going to try and cast a Jimmy Stewart, it would be Kevin Costner, And I think he's very good in the film. This is terrible, this scene. It's just awful. It's really bad. What's about to transpire here is just like Maudlin doesn't begin to describe it. It's the weakest scene in the film, I think, by far. And I think totally unnecessary. Again, it's just purely to make him out to be, to make Garrison out as a saint. The beleaguered, the beleaguered all-American male trying to stand up for truth and justice, The writing's so terrible. The kids are actually pretty good. That's Sean Stone, Oliver Stone's son there on the left. But I think they're not too bad. They just, there's nothing to work with. It's just the dialogue's awful. There's the fake version of the magic bullet that we're going to see in the courtroom. I do think this scene here is pretty ponderous. Yeah, here comes a bit of Garrison being persecuted. I actually think Garrison got away with a hell of a lot. And he should have been stopped much earlier, I think, before he was able to do as much damage as he did. Destroying people's lives. I think, fair to say, causing the death of David Ferrie and contributing to the premature demise of Clay Shaw and bankrupting Shaw. And, this was cut out of the theatrical version, and rightfully so. I find it very strange. I actually don't know anything really about this story, but given the rest that's put forward in this film, I doubt it's very credible. But and this kind of macho posturing is very sort of a bit cliche. Now, this is actually an example of how official stupidity aided and abetted in conspiracy theories. This did happen. Oswald went to this FBI agent, Hosty, to complain about what he called harassment of his wife. Hosty kept his note and was told to destroy it. He was told to destroy it for very obvious reasons. It would have made the FBI look horrible because people would have said, well, it's this shows that we should have known. We knew about Oswald. We should have known he would do this. We should have known he would kill the president. And how could we possibly fail to protect JFK? And this will be a huge scandal. Get rid of it. So he did, and that was it was mammoth stupidity and irresponsibility, and in some ways dereliction of duty on the part of the FBI, and it fed conspiracy theories for decades. And there were a lot of things like that, things that were done for stupid reasons or to save face or to preserve the sensibilities of the Kennedy family, which were understandable, and things of that kind. Some things that were done for good reasons, some things that were done for bad reasons that only fed the frenzy that erupted among the conspiracy theories, conspiracy buffs. Really, mainly after Lane published Rush to Judgment, is when they really took off. This bit that Oswald is responsible for the telex is really disgusting. This idea that the fear was that a right wing group would do it because Dallas was known as a hostile city, and they called it I think the city of hate, or the capital of hate in the U.S. It was a very right wing city, and they actually didn't like the fact that JFK was going there because there was the fear that he would meet with protests or even assault, because Adlai Stevenson had been assaulted there a few months before, so there were concerns about that. And unfortunately, at the time when he arrived, he got such a great reception that everyone was surprised and happy and then he was killed. But this idea that Oswald actually tried to prevent the assassination, this is disgusting. That's disgusting. I think disgusting thing to say, that he was some kind of hero. But it's where you go when you go down that rabbit hole. It's the end of that sort of hideous logic. Oswald didn't do it. Maybe he tried to prevent it. Maybe he was a hero. It goes there. Things get way out there. The FBI's complicity. I think Michael Rooker's making some good points here, actually. Although it's totally stacked against him. Yeah, they don't have anything. And that was kind of the point. They didn't have anything. It's funny here, because here he actually admits that there's nothing to prosecute Shaw on. He's a toehold. He's he's a way to get to the big guys. And that's basically admitting that you don't have anything on him, you know? I don't know who he is. That means I don't know what his crime is. I don't know what he did. It's very ironic to me that Stone basically admits that there was no case against Shaw. You know, he then has to portray Shaw as being guilty because then that justifies Garrison's persecution of Shaw. Yeah, I think this is really Stone sort of making his case against the other factions. I mean, there's sort of different camps of conspiracy theorists. There's people who say the mob did it. There's people who say the CIA did it. There's people who say the anti-Castro Cubans did it. And then there's people who say that everybody did it. I think Stone sort of tentatively comes down in that last one, the everybody did it sort of idea. But I think he mostly leans towards the CIA. I mean, that's really where he's at. CIA and the military-industrial complex, basically. You know, I don't think the mob interests him very much, to be fully honest. He's sort of what he's really after is the vast power structures that people on the left quite often discuss in a very strange and abstract way, and have a terribly difficult time explaining when you try to bust them down to specifics, you know. And in the end, they just start yelling about how you're not, you know, you're a conformist or you're a sheep or you're, you know, whatever. Of course, people on the right talk about sheep as well. You know, the sheeple, as I think Alex Jones uses that phrase a lot. You know, a lot of Alex Jones in this movie, actually. It's a lot of that mentality. Now, again, here they're setting up this character Broussard as the traitor. Um, of course, he's kind of the only actually sane person in the movie. I mean, that obviously wasn't Stone's intention, but I think he sort of comes off that way. I mean, what he's saying makes a great deal of sense, you know. But I do find these scenes somewhat ponderous, you know. They're sort of like, I mean, the really ponderous bit comes at the end with Garrison's summation, which is just kind of like endless, you know. But I think here too, there's a lot of ranting, you know. Um, when the characters start to rant in this movie, it gets pretty bad. But it's a classic. That's the conspiracy theorists. They rant. That's what they do. You know, they try to overwhelm you with violence of rhetoric. Really, you know, they sort of feel like if they yell long enough and loud enough that you'll shut up and let them get away with it. You know, because you're not as passionate about reality as they are passionate about the conspiracy theory. And I have to admit that it works most of the time. You know, it's very hard to argue with a conspiracy theorist because they're so um, fervent, you know, and quite often fervency and fanaticism um, is more effective than sort of sobriety and reason. The fanatical people are willing to fight for what they believe in, even if what they believe in is psychotic, you know. And it's a very dangerous thing. We see it now with Muslim radicals. You know, I worry a lot about radical Islam, not because I think it's um, true, uh, but because I think it's they believe so intensely, and the sensible people often don't. I think that gives them a tremendous advantage, which is very frightening. This is a this was not in the theatrical version, and I think that was much for the better because I think this is maybe the worst scene in the film. It's based off of an appearance that Garrison made on the Johnny Carson show, which I haven't seen. It's probably on YouTube somewhere, but uh, This is like Stone isn't just stacking the deck. He's just blatantly, you know, he's just blatantly congratulating himself. Really, I mean the way that John Larroquette, who was really big actually when this movie came out, he was a big TV star. Um, he's pretty forgotten now, I think. He The way this guy's such a clown, you know, is portrayed as such a clown, and is so blatantly biased and is so blatantly sort of stupid. I think is it just makes the whole thing totally ridiculous. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt. Every Everything here that ironically, everything that Larroquette's character is saying here is absolutely true. Yeah, he intimidated, drugged, bribed, you know. He hypnotized them too, you know. And of course, what does Costner say? It's all a conspiracy. This is really an interesting thing for me because um, it's the ironic thing is that the head of the Soviet Union, in fact, was shot by a lone nut, and it was not a conspiracy. I mean, that's what's so hilarious. Lenin was shot by a young woman who failed to kill him, but he lived. I think he lived with the bullet in his brain for the rest of his life, and there's theories that it may have contributed to his dementia and eventual sort of premature death. But yeah, they shot someone shot the head of the Soviet Union, and it was not a conspiracy. So uh, you know, it's hilarious in a certain way. It's wonderfully ironic. Anyway, the Tramps is like was a huge thing for years. Who were the Tramps? Why won't the government tell us who the Tramps were, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? As far as I've been able to find out, all of them have been found and identified, and they were exactly what they were claiming to be. So, you know, it's another glorious piece of nonsense, but wonderfully sinister. I think. Who were these tramps? You know, and the way Stone keeps showing them over and over again. This is actually probably an even worse scene because it just makes no sense. Like, why is this guy Broussard there? What's the whole point of this? Like, it doesn't, and it adds nothing to the film. This was also not in the theatrical version, which I again I think the theatrical version was superior. It was leaner and it was more to the point, and it was less. There's a sense of bloat to the director's cut, I think, and I mean the film was long anyway. Now it's much too long, you know, and I think that an extra 25 minutes into a film that's already this enormous is totally unnecessary. But unfortunately, the theatrical cut is appears to be gone. You know, there's all of the available versions are the director's cut, and it'll probably always remain that way. I have to say, I also don't think Costner's very good in this scene, which is not somewhat unusual. I think he's very good most of the rest of the movie. The scene that's going to come up here, I mean, there's no. I suppose that this is the only time really. First of all, it is again the homophobia, but um, I guess this is the time to talk about it. There's been what I think is a very credible accusation of sexual molestation committed by Garrison. I've read an interview with the brother of the young boy who was the alleged victim, and I think it's quite credible, the accusation against him, and I think it goes to the fact that you know Garrison was a very dark character in real life. I mean, he was I think he was a pretty twisted individual, and you know um, his obsessions with homosexuality and stuff like that may well have stemmed from the fact that he was himself a had homosexual tendencies and may in fact have been pedophilic. So, and that's pretty much all I'll say about it. Nothing's ever been proven, and now never will be. But I think particularly in the era of Me Too, I think we have to take charges like that very seriously, and I personally believe it. I think that I think Garrison did try to molest that boy. So uh, here we come back into domesticity. Uh, it's really very treacly. This is another scene that was added, which I think again is equally superfluous. It's interesting that Stone pretty much cut out the whole subplot of Broussard's treachery. That's where a lot of these extra scenes come from. Is this plot regarding his assistant who betrays him, which then hands over which then becomes the excuse for why the trial was lost. Um, Here we're getting into Bobby Kennedy, also victim of the violence of the times. I actually have a much higher opinion of Bobby Kennedy than I do of JFK. I think John Kennedy, and I'm of a generation where you could say this. No one who lived through this assassination era would say something like this, but I think JFK, generally speaking, was not a very admirable person. I think he was very smart and he did some good things. But as a human being, I don't think he was a man of particular integrity, or I don't think he was a very admirable man as a person, let's say. I certainly don't think there was anything particularly heroic about him, except his actions in World War II were definitely heroic. But as far as a politician, I don't think there's much heroic about him. I do think that Bobby Kennedy had a great deal of integrity, and I think was genuinely a compassionate person, and someone who, whether you agree with his politics or not, was someone who did want to change things for the better. And I think in some ways his death is even more tragic than JFK's. I think Bobby Kennedy was probably the only person who might have been able to pull the country together after the events of 67 and 68 and race riots in Vietnam and protests and all that. I think Bobby Kennedy possibly could have pulled it. I don't know if anyone could have pulled it off. Probably not, but I think Bobby Kennedy might have been able to do it, at least to some degree, or at least ameliorate some of the upheaval. And I do think his death really was a horrendous tragedy for the United States. Blaming it on the conspiracy is, I think, in some ways motivated by the same reason that so many people, I think on the left anyway, I think so many people are in denial about Oswald. Bobby Kennedy was murdered by a Palestinian extremist, and on the left, the Palestinians for many years have been such a sort of icon, a kind of precious icon that no flaw can be permitted to exist, in it. They have to be perfect innocence. The idea that their great hope, the icon of their hope for peace and change, was murdered by a Palestinian is simply unthinkable to them. It's beyond their comprehension. So they deny it, and it becomes a vast conspiracy. I think Kennedy died a martyr for Israel and for the Jewish people. I think, and I think that he ought to be commended as such. He died because he supported Israel and he supported Israel's right to defend itself, and he was murdered by someone who wanted to destroy Israel. And I think that Bobby Kennedy should really be seen as someone who died for sanctification of the name, essentially. This scene is so silly I can't even discuss it. So here's what I want to do. Bobby Kennedy's just been killed. I've been proved right. I'm going to go have sex with my wife. It's just so absurd. And really kind of uncomfortable. I don't know. There's something creepy about this scene. There's something like not, I don't know. There's something, I don't know what it is. It's just so absurd. And of course, in real life, she never accepted it and never believed him. And his Garrison's wife divorced him, some years later. And as far as I know, I don't think she believed it. So, although God knows what actually caused the divorce, I have no idea. I doubt Mr. Garrison was a very easy man to live with. Ay, ay, ay. The dialogue's terrible. But I think Stone was putting these in as a concession to mainstream audiences, I suppose. Human interest, create a human story. It worked. Film did very well. It was kind of a sleeper hit. There was a huge amount of controversy around it, and so much so that I'm not sure anyone really gave much thought as to whether the film would be a box office success or not. But it was. It sort of started slowly, and then it just took on a momentum of its own. And I think that its success also had certain political ramifications. It led to the release of a large amount of files pertaining to the assassination, none of which contained anything even remotely proving a conspiracy. But it is a very moving film. It's a very powerful picture, and audiences responded to that. Here we go into the trial scene, which is both in some ways is in certain parts very silly and in certain parts absolutely brilliant. I mean, the moment when he reconstructs the assassination is just extraordinary, and it's also blatantly portrayed, as the Shaw's slick Southern lawyer discrediting everybody. You know what I mean? As if there was no problem with their testimony except their character, whereas in fact, their testimony fell apart more or less immediately. And the judge is also portrayed falsely as being very anti-Garrison. He is, again, stacking the deck, which Stone does the whole time. I think Stone felt justified because he felt that the Warren Commission had stacked the deck. And therefore he was entitled to stack it on the other end to make an impact. You exaggerate to make a point. So I think that's how Stone justified it to himself. I think he knew he was doing it. He's actually said that JFK was constructed as a counter myth to the sort of, I suppose you could say, conventional account of the put forward by the Warren Commission. Garrison used the perjury charge as a way to intimidate people in a pretty unethical way. This is really the thing that put the final this was the fatal headshot for Garrison's case. This guy was real. He did testify this way. He was a complete lunatic. He really did say that he actually said there was a conspiracy to control his mind or something like that. And yeah, he fingerprinted his daughter to make sure she was the same person when she came back from college. And of course he goes here, oh, that was one of Bill's witnesses, which is nonsense. Actually, Garrison was the one who found him. Garrison was the one who insisted on him being included, even though his whole staff was telling him that he was that this guy was completely crazy. So yeah, this is again, I think Garrison faked the alias thing, and I think the judge was right to rule it out. And Stone doesn't show it, but the judge actually said in open court, I do not believe Officer, whatever his name was. The officer had a hilarious name, very New Orleans. It's like Aloysius Habergast or something like that, But he did say, I don't believe him, so. And I think rightfully so. Garrison, yeah, once you sort of read about what Garrison was really like, then you realize it's perfectly possible. He, I believe that Shaw sued him over these over both this trial and the perjury charges, and unfortunately died before it could be ruled on. Again, prematurely. Here's where we go into, I think here's where we go into the real meat of this, which is pretty extraordinary what is about to happen in terms of a piece of cinema. It's a tour de force of creating this kind of kaleidoscopic vision of one event, sort of the way Michelangelo Antonioni did in Blow Up, with the successive larger and larger enlargements of the photograph, and then, finally realizing actually there's a man with a gun in the bushes, and it's very much like this. The Zapruder film is pretty horrifying stuff. People gasp when this, and he goes right in on it, on the headshot, yeah. Frame 313, as it's often referred to. Yeah. Yeah, it's raw history written as lightning, as Woodrow Wilson once said, This was, I think, the first time that it was ever shown publicly. It was not shown as a film to the public, but I think most of the frames were printed in Life magazine very shortly after the assassination. And the headshot frame was not, it was described, but it was not shown for, I think it would have been seen as blasphemous and desecration at the time, given the grief that the country was in, and, the grief and the shock. Again, this is not true. 5.6 seconds was not pinpointed as the absolute amount of time for the assassination. But Lord, the conspiracy theorists love it. The way that Stone keeps returning to this will kind of hit people with this trauma. I think it is a large part of what gives the film its power. But it's also quite ghoulish. I mean, it's you have to wonder about someone who wants to keep hitting you in the face with that kind of Grand Guignol snuff movie kind of stuff, This is rubbish. This is complete nonsense. They never said, first of all, it's a lie, because he's got them seating level, the men giving the example, whereas in fact Kennedy was higher than Connolly in the car. They never said it waited in midair. They never said it made that big spin. It essentially came down straight, went through Kennedy, hit Connolly, and then sort of dipped to a lower angle, and then came out Connolly's side, struck him in the wrist, and then lodged in his thigh. It was once you see the diagrams of what the Warren Commission actually said, it seems perfectly plausible. And high-powered rifle bullets do all kinds of stuff. And the bullet was tumbling, certainly by the time that it hit Connolly. So it's not almost pristine. It was certainly a damaged bullet. It's simply not true. This is brilliant demagoguery, though. Well, the government says it can prove it. That's very much like, to me, a kind of right wing. It's the government. The government done it. It's kind of classic, like, Alex Jones type of. Yeah. again, it's not foundational. It came out of the physical evidence that indicated a single assassin. And it also came through an examination of the Zapruder film, and it was the best hypothesis that they could come up with. The Warren Commission was really trying to reach, let's say, the most credible scenario for the assassination. They were not kind of completely... They wanted to make a finding of fact, but there were many, many cases where they admitted, we don't... we're not entirely sure about this. This seems to be the most likely explanation, And I have to say, I think the Warren Commission is one of the most unfairly maligned, I don't know what the word would call it. It's sort of, the report anyway is one of the most maligned documents of the 20th century, and quite unfairly, I think. I think they did a very good job considering the time constraints they were under and the amount of public pressure they were under. Yeah, this is extraordinary. The way this just keeps returning. You keep returning to the scene of violence, to the scene of trauma, as if in doing so you can achieve a kind of catharsis. You can achieve a kind of release from national trauma and find the truth, the key, the truth that conspiracy theorists always go on and on about, That is very powerful. Blast it out. Dr. Peters, and suddenly Dr. Peters is there. It's really brilliantly staged. It's brilliantly put together. All the stuff about the autopsy, Stone, in his commentary of this film, claims that there were two autopsies, which is literally impossible because no one ever left Kennedy's body from the moment he was pronounced dead to the moment that he was buried. The autopsy... the reason why people have such problems with the autopsy is that it wasn't really an autopsy. It was more kind of like a post-mortem. It wasn't a full autopsy can take a day, 2 days to do. It's extremely thorough. It's extremely invasive to the body. You basically cut the body up into bits and examine each little piece of it. And it's one of the reasons why many people are uncomfortable with having their loved ones autopsied, because it is so violating. You literally had Jackie Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy sitting in sort of in the room outside the operating theater when they were doing the autopsy. And, from what I've read, Bobby Kennedy was like pacing back and forth, being like, when are they going to be finished? And I don't know how long it took exactly, but it was like 3-4 hours or something was the autopsy, which is really nothing. They were on tremendous pressure to do it. I think some of these autopsy photographs are real, which I think is... That, I have to say, is unnecessarily ghoulish. Yeah. There's no need for that. There just really isn't. He could have just faked it so easily. There's no need to see that. I think it's violating on a certain level. I think, again, it's a case with the autopsies. It's again a case of the Kennedy families. The Kennedy family demanding things for very good reasons and perfectly understandable reasons that unfortunately ended up giving fuel to the conspiracy theorists. Why was the autopsy botched? Well, it wasn't botched. It was rushed. It wasn't, and it was done under conditions of extreme duress. And, you could say the historical record suffered for that reason, but no one was thinking clearly at this time. Nothing like this had happened in 6 decades, and the whole country was completely in shock. And I don't think anyone was thinking straight for quite a while, to be fully honest. Certainly not until after the funeral was over, and even then, I'm not sure America's thinking straight now, to be fully honest. Maybe America's never quite gotten over this assassination. People do mark the kind of upheavals of the 60s begin. People mark it with Kennedy's assassination. Yeah. I think that's magical thinking to a certain degree, but culturally speaking, in terms of national mood, psychology, there could be something in that. It's difficult to fully explain the trauma of it. I mean, yeah, that shot's real, which again, not necessary. Um, 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 I completely lost my train of thought. Yeah, the limousine was actually reused. I mean, that's what's remarkable. It was in service for several decades. I think afterwards. Yeah, here comes the brain has disappeared. The government. People did audibly gasp in the theater when I saw this. Um, the brain, as I said before, the brain was taken by Bobby Kennedy and interred um, with JFK's body in Arlington Cemetery. I believe when the body was reinterred after the memorial with the eternal flame had been completed. I think they reinterred the body, and the brain was buried with it then. The epileptic has been identified. He was a real guy. He was a real epileptic. He really went to the hospital and just felt better and went home. And felt like he didn't want to go through all the rigmarole of checking himself in and checking himself out and waiting to be examined and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and just sort of, This is a tour de force sequence. This is just absolutely extraordinary. No doubt about it. All these different film stocks, as if, it's as if you've sort of got this, again, kaleidoscopic view where you have this one event and then all the different ways that it was perceived. It's almost like theoretical physics, you can only see or measure a particle by moving it. You know what I mean? It's like the uncertainty principle or something like that. It's like it's this event horizon of history, really, that's happening here. I think that there are something like 8 or 9 shots that Stone theorizes here. Nobody said that they heard that many shots, as far as I know. Nobody. There are people said 3, people said 4, there are people said 2, as far as I remember. But nobody said that there are that many shots, as far as I know. But the way this builds, yeah. And the way he narrates each of these things, and we know what's coming. We know it's hurtling towards us. This thing that we wish we could undo, but we know we can't. And this when I saw this for the first time, the tension built up here, similar to in the opening montage. The tension that's built up in this moment was almost unbearable. I mean, it really is an incredible piece of filmmaking, and the recreations are amazing. I mean, just looks really, particularly the scenes that are shot in Super 8, stuff like that, that it looks totally authentic, which people had a problem with. Um, yeah, and then that moment when the projector starts going and you see the Zapruder film, that just was transporting, when I first saw this. And John Williams' music is just incredible, just pounding, you know, very declarative horns, slowing down the JFK theme. Yeah, that was actually, they think, because his spine was not nicked, but there was a the impact created a shockwave that injured his spine, and as a result, his arms shot up involuntarily, and he couldn't be taken down. You can see Jackie kind of pulling on him, trying to pull his arms down, and she can't. Again, he's only like halfway through the shooting here. Somewhere around this time now. I mean, if you look at it, I mean, this is pure speculation. There's even less evidence for this than there is. I mean, at least the Warren Commission had evidence. You know what I mean? Like, Stone doesn't even have any evidence for this. You know, here's the famous line, back and to the left. Just boring in on this. This is snuff film stuff. I think this is a bit much. I don't really think he had to go this far personally. Stone said it was because he wanted to pound into people's heads that it was obviously from the front. It's funny because by looking at it this close, you can actually see the back of his head is fine. It blows out the side, which is quite consistent with him being shot from the back. So oddly enough, Stone visually, I mean, disproves himself, back into the left, back into the left. Yeah, well, you can see there's a reason he goes back. It's because it explodes at the side of his head, and then the force of that jet effect blasts him backwards. If he'd been shot through the front of the head, he actually would have snapped back and then shot forward, from the jet effect coming out the back. So Stone sort of disproves himself in that moment. So it's ironic, but terribly effective as a piece of cinema. But again, ghoulish, I think. Borders on the snuff film. I don't think the film would have been as powerful without it, which again, when I say that it's a great evil film, that it's evil in some ways is inherent, is absolutely essential to its greatness. Because I don't think this film would be nearly as powerful if it didn't go too far. I think if he didn't bore in on that horrific moment, that head wound, this film wouldn't have anything close to the impact that it does. So morally it's reprehensible. Artistically, it's genius. Yeah. Again, this is all. No, this is all stuff that Stone's culled from various conspiracy books and sort of all thrown together. Again, it comes down to me the fact that Stone is not a trained historian, and neither, by the way, are almost all conspiracy theorists. They're amateurs. They're what they call the buffs. The conspiracy buffs. Or the assassination buffs. But. There's a sort of again, this is Stone totally stacking the deck. Investigators did these walks. They went up the stairs, down the stairs at various paces, and it was perfectly possible for Oswald to get where he wanted to be. Bonnie Raitt Williams, ironically, is one of the guys who was on the floor below and heard the gunshots from above him. So again, Stone doesn't bother to mention that, but unfortunately, being a black man, I'm not sure that Mr. Williams was. I think his testimony may have been unfairly dismissed because he was black. Certainly in Texas at that time, or even anywhere in America at this time, it's perfectly possible. Yeah, the buffs are not. None of them are trained historians. Stone is not a trained historian. And one of the first things I am a trained historian. I have 2 degrees in history, but I mean I'm not a historian by profession, but I have 2 degrees in history. The one of the most essential aspects of doing history, of writing history, is to know how to evaluate sources. If you can't do that, then you can't do history. You have to assess what's true, not what's true, but what's likely true, what's likely false. You can never know with any absolute certainty. It doesn't work that way. For example, newspapers usually are not particularly reliable. Field reports usually are fairly reliable. Things like that. You learn eyewitness testimony is incredibly unreliable, and of course, a lot of what Stone says here is eyewitness testimony or anecdote, sometimes hearsay, all of which are extremely low forms of evidence. But again, he doesn't have the training to understand that you have to look at sources and evaluate how believable they are in objective terms. Objectively speaking, is this, likely accurate? And I don't think Stone knows how to do that, and I don't think any, there may be 1 or 2 exceptions, but I don't think any of the conspiracy theorists understand that. This is where it gets really disgusting, I think, where he starts to mythologize Oswald and try to turn him into a hero in spite of his warning, as if Oswald had actually tried to stop the assassination and loved JFK. It's It's pretty appalling. It's really quite disgusting. You know. May give his mother, Marguerite Oswald, her final victory, though. She was a complete lunatic who, as I've said, I think probably molested her son. And I saw an interview of her where she said, someday people will know that Lee Harvey Oswald was even more important. What he did was even more important to the United States than what John F. Kennedy did. I think Stone is taking Miss Oswald's side. Mark Lane certainly did. He was a lawyer for Marguerite Oswald. I think they were well suited to each other. With the exception that I think Marguerite Oswald was just a nut. I think Lane was a genuinely sinister individual, scoundrel, really. Here he goes into how, we don't know if he really did it. All these witnesses saw different things. As far as I know, almost all of the close witnesses saw him either commit the shooting or immediately after he committed it. They picked him out of a lineup. There's no question that Oswald, there's even better evidence that Oswald killed Tippit than that he killed JFK, and the evidence that he killed JFK is pretty much ironclad. So. Insofar as I'm aware, that's not true. I believe that all the witnesses were taken to a lineup. I'm not entirely certain of that, but certainly the majority of them were. Now, here we go into what I think is Stone's most, and I've talked about it before, but I think his most egregious lie, and I think it is a conscious lie. Oswald was seen doing the shooting by a man named Brennan. I think his first name was Howard. A man named Brennan who had extremely good distance vision. He was farsighted. And the description of Oswald from the that was sent out to the patrol cars came mainly from Brennan, although there were a few other people who I think saw him as well, but the best description was Brennan's. This line here about the Reichstag fire is despicable. It's really disgusting. No one knew. No one was saying anything like that. Somebody saw him commit the assassination and gave the police a description. This guy, this theater guy, the theater owner saw him, or the manager saw him, recognized him from the description, called the police. And then, of course, what Stone again lies about, and I think again consciously lies, Oswald did try to murder, and he didn't just wildly draw his gun. He pulled the trigger, and the policeman that he was aiming at rammed his hand underneath the hammer, and the hammer came down and caught on the webbing between his thumb and his forefinger. And that was the only thing that saved his life. So Oswald would have had a third victim that day if it hadn't been for that, So he does not know the unseen forces raging. It's just disgusting the way that he tries to make Oswald into a martyr and into a victim and into a hero even, Although Gary Oldman is unbelievably good. I mean, it's just really quite stunning. Again, this is nonsense. Jack Ruby wasn't let in through a side door. He walked down the ramp and got in that way. He was known to the police. They would not have viewed him as a threat. He was thought of as just kind of a local kook. And just so you know, he didn't shout Oswald. He shouted, "You killed my president." Which I think Stone, again, probably deliberate. And this is ridiculous. Everyone's standing around staring, as if, well, it's been done. We got rid of the patsy. It's just such nonsense. They were on Ruby immediately. I mean, it was just like, you can see it. Anyone can see it. It's on YouTube. You can see the live shooting. Who weeps for Lee Harvey Oswald? It's disgusting. I think we're going here into the summation, which is just endless. It is somewhat taken from Garrison's summation. It's partly Stone's invention. I think this is what Stone would say if he was running for office, I think. but it does. It's interesting though if you look at what Garrison's saying here. It's interesting to sort of think about what Stone's real ideology is. I mean, what does Stone really believe? Because as I've said before, I don't think it's possible to describe Stone as, you sort of immediately sort of think of him as someone of the left, just from the company he keeps sometimes and stuff like that. But I think there's as much of the extreme right here as there is the left. I had an editor I worked for a while ago, who once described Stone as an anarcho-fascist, which is, to be honest with you, I think probably the best description. Obviously, there's a contradiction there in that fascism is all about authority and anarchism is about destroying authority. But I think there is, in the fact that there's one side of Stone that is deeply anarchistic and hates establishments, hates the governments, hates militaries, hates military-industrial complex, and there's a desire in him to just tear it all down, to just rip it all to shreds, and start over, as Garrison says here, a little further out west, which is in a way a very American type of anarchism. But there's another side to him, which is the cult of the true people, the real country, as opposed to its government. There's a cult of the masculine virtues in this film, a cult of military service, a cult of sort of more what you would regard as sort of classically right-wing sort of ideas. Certainly a cult of violence. There's a fascination with violence and with the capacities of violence, and a cult of power. Strangely enough. And as I said before, then Mr. X's, John Sutherland's speech when he talks about how politics is power, nothing more, and the authority of a government over its people rests in its war powers. That's fascism. That is essentially what fascism believes. Fascism believes in authority and it believes in power as the sole motive forces of existence. And that is Stone's theory here in a way. Is that power is everything, and that's not, as I said, that's not foreign to the left either. That's basically Foucault's theory. Everything is power. There's nothing but power relationships, but that's also fascism. And I think describing Stone as an anarcho-fascist is probably as accurate as you can get. For a man who I think his thinking is pretty muddled and is ultimately, a dramatist and not a historian and not a political thinker, So I think a guy like Stone and quite frankly, almost, I would say all of the real conspiracy fanatics, they're operating off emotion, really, They're working off of resentments and anger and hatreds and fears, terrors, and love, and belief and faith, that drive their view of the world in a way that is ultimately irrational. I don't think that any of them are thinking in any kind of clear, logical way. And they see what they want to see and believe what they want to believe, or what they need to see or what they need to believe. And on the one hand, there's plenty of reason in the world to be angry and fearful and to want to change things and to want a different life, a better life. There's more than enough reason in this world of ours to do that. But I think that when you descend into the irrational, when you descend into paranoia, where you descend into madness, essentially, and when you start to lie to yourself, and lie to other people, especially, and when you start to hate other people because of those lies, and when you start to form a moral lexicon, a moral structure for yourself out of those lies, that, I think, is in many ways the most dangerous thing that a human being can do. It's what Hitler did. It's what Osama bin Laden did. And it's what the conspiracy theorists, on a smaller scale, I'm not comparing them to Osama bin Laden, but theirs is a kind of fetal form. It's like an amniotic form of that kind of thinking. Radical Islam is a conspiracy theory. The evil West is trying to destroy Islam, and we need to fight the poor, beleaguered Islamic Ummah. when in fact, I mean, Islam's been as brutal and imperialist and colonialist as any other empire. No more. I mean, it's no worse than the Roman Empire or the Ottoman, not the Ottoman. Ottoman is an Islamic empire, or any empire that's existed on Earth. They've all done horrible things, and so is Islam. It's no better or worse on that level. But radical Muslims believe that A, what they're doing to Islam is worse than anything else, and B, Islam is better than everything else. And that justifies their violence. That justifies their inhumanity. And it's the same with Hitler. The Germans did plenty of horrible things, but no, for Hitler, Germany was the beleaguered victim, and the Jews were the evil persecutors, when in fact the Jews were perfectly innocent. The Jews had never done anything that Hitler claimed they did, ever. And in creating that moral universe that fed his belief in his own righteousness, and by imparting that to the German people, that's what made the Holocaust possible. It justified the Nazis' inhumanity. It justified their violence. It justified the eclipse of humanity. And that's what worries me about films like this. That's why I think films like this have a certain evil to them, because it is. The way, I have to admit, the way Costner delivers this speech is pretty impressive. I mean, he's got a lot of text to get through here, and he does it pretty well. When he starts to break down a bit, it's right up on the edge of camp there, but I think it works. I think when I saw this in the theater, I found this quite moving. Although now I watch it and I just feel like it goes on forever. I just think it's way too long. But when I was saying about how this film is, why I call it evil, is that it feeds into that way of thinking that can justify truly horrific stuff. Whether it's the Gulag, whether it's Stalin, Mao, the Cultural Revolution, the Holocaust, 9/11, all of these things ultimately come from conspiracy thinking, I think. And the way that this film promotes conspiracy, convinces people of conspiracy, and urges them to take moral action on the basis of those beliefs. I think this film is evil. It's also quite brilliant. There's no question. And maybe it's evil. It's brilliant because it's evil, and it's evil because it's brilliant. I'm perfectly content to take that contradiction. Maybe it's not even a contradiction. It's just a fact, I think this is the moment when he turns to the camera. Or it's coming up. Yeah, this is Stone. This is Stone writing his presidential inauguration speech. I think Stone would love to be president, personally. I think that may be his secret ambition. Yeah, here. That was pretty electrifying. But that statement, it's up to you. To me, that's a very ominous statement. It's a very dark statement. It's up to you. I worry about what people may decide to do because of this film or films like this. I do worry about that. People have shot up synagogues because of conspiracy theories. That's what they thought. Someone was like, well, it's up to you. So they went and did it. People have been murdered in their millions, because of that imperative. The deliberations, I think, on this took about 45 minutes. I believe. And in fact, one of the jurors later said that it would have taken even shorter, but a few of them had to go to the bathroom first. So there was no doubt about how they would rule. Again, it was shorter than the O.J. Simpson verdict, So to say that Garrison hadn't made his case would be an understatement. Garrison made a fool of himself. Yeah. I mean, it was a farce, a circus, as the cliche goes. Yeah, this is rubbish. This is rubbish. In fact, one of the jurors said to, I can't remember who it was, but he said something like, he said, I didn't think too much of the Warren report before the trial, and now I think a lot more of it. Yeah, no, this was. Yeah, here's Jimmy Stewart. This is the Jimmy Stewart moment. I'm going to run again. He did win again, and he was eventually elected a judge, which tells you something about the power of demagoguery, I think. You know, if you're good at it, you can get very far in a democracy. It's scary. Look at Trump, you know, the ultimate demagogue. Yeah, this to me is very stereotypically gay. Should go home and cook some eggs buffet. It's really pretty bad. And we're finally getting out of it after 3.5 hours. Yeah. Yeah, Richard Helms never admitted anything of this kind. He admitted that the CIA had interviewed Shaw on several occasions, as they'd done with a gazillion other business leaders, and that was all to it. No autopsy was allowed. I mean, it's just absurd. Autopsies aren't usually done if they know what caused it. So, but he was killed too. Apparently, that's what that's what's obviously being implied. It's not a very. The fact that you brought the only public prosecution in the Kennedy killing is not something to be proud of. If you prosecuted an innocent man, I mean, the fact that it's the only one is irrelevant. It's like saying, well, Castro outlived 8 American presidents. Like, yeah, he never had to run for re-election. It's an indictment of Castro, not the opposite. The House Select Committee. It's probably too complicated to go into. In the short time we have left on these credits, but basically they based their idea that there was a probable conspiracy. The head of the committee actually thought it was a mob conspiracy, and I think he fixated on that, which is one of the reasons they found that there was a probable conspiracy. It was based on acoustic evidence, which later turned out to be, to put it shortly, was discredited. It turned out not to be an audio recording of Dealey Plaza. They thought they heard 4 shots. Not heard. They examined they examined it and they found acoustic pulses or something that they interpreted as shots, and there seemed to be 4 of them. So they said, well, there had to be a conspiracy. But it was later revealed that the tape was not even from Dealey Plaza, and that there was actually an audio recording of the assassination that was erased the same day, believe it or not, by mistake. But the reporter who made the recording did listen to it, and he testified that he heard 3 shots. Interesting enough, I think he said there were 2 pretty close together, and then the last one a little bit later. He said it was as if he'd taken his time to aim the last time, which I think is probably true, unfortunately. Look at this cast. This is truly incredible. Joe Pesci, Walter Matthau, yeah. Yeah, John Candy is great. Wow. Yeah. Well, anyway, I hope you don't mind me ragging on this film for 3.5 hours. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I thank you for indulging my self-indulgence and doing these commentaries. And I'll see you on the next one. Thanks.